Howdy folks. You're watching Arcane Paradox. Sit tight because today we bring you Harry filed an inheritance claim through the ministry and had Vernon Dursley charged with financial fraud. Smash that like, subscribe, and enjoy the ride. Chapter 1, The Letter That Wasn't Lost. The owl arrived on a Tuesday. Harry knew it was a Tuesday because Dudley had rugby practice on Tuesdays, which meant the house was quieter than usual, just the distant sound of Aunt Petunia's gardening shears snipping at something that didn't need snipping, and the low grumble of a lawnmower 2 streets over. It was the kind of morning where Privet Drive looked exactly like what it was pretending to be, perfectly ordinary, perfectly peaceful, perfectly content with itself. Harry was sitting on the narrow ledge of his bedroom window, one leg dangling out over the flowerbed below, reading a battered copy of Advanced Defensive Casting that Hermione had sent him at the start of summer with a note that said "Don't let Ron convince you the index is optional," which was such a specific warning that Harry had immediately read the index first. Hedwig was asleep in her cage, head tucked under one wing, unbothered by the heat that had been pressing down on Surrey for the past 2 weeks like something that had given up trying to leave. He heard the second owl before he saw it, a sharp, businesslike series of wing beats, nothing like Hedwig's easy glide. It came in from the south, moving low and fast over the row of identical rooftops, and landed on his windowsill with the no-nonsense attitude of something that billed by the hour. It was a large, tawny bird he didn't recognize, wearing a brass leg band stamped with a symbol he'd seen before, a stylized G worked into the profile of a goblin's sharp-featured face. Gringotts. Harry sat up straighter and held out his arm. The owl transferred the letter to his hand with minimal ceremony, accepted the piece of toast crust he offered, and departed immediately, already wheeling back south before Harry had even broken the envelope seal. The envelope itself was heavier than he expected. Cream-colored parchment, the kind that felt almost waxy under your fingers, embossed with the full formal name of the bank in copper lettering. His name on the front was written in the precise, angular script that goblins used for official correspondence, nothing like the looping handwriting of a wizard, all sharp lines and deliberate pressure, as if the pen had been pressed down hard enough to make a point. Harry James Potter. Sole heir, Potter Family Estate. Reference, Audit Case 7741, p. He unfolded it. The language was dense, formal, and almost aggressively bureaucratic in the way that legal documents always are, as though the words themselves were designed to discourage casual reading. But Harry had spent 3 years at Hogwarts, which meant he'd read enough enchanted textbooks, ministry pamphlets, and Hermione's annotated essays to know how to strip the procedural flesh off a document and find the bones underneath. He read it slowly. Then he read it again. By the 3rd time through, he'd stopped noticing the heat. The letter informed him, formally, with considerable legal weight behind every clause, that the Gringotts Bank had completed a routine audit of the Potter Family Trust, reference account 687, and had identified a series of irregular disbursements dating back approximately 13 years. The disbursements had been authorized through a secondary access arrangement established in November 1981, 2 months after his parents' deaths, and had continued, quarterly, without interruption, until the current audit flagged them for review. The total sum disbursed through this secondary arrangement, over 13 years, was listed near the bottom of the second page. Harry read the number 3 times. Then he sat very still for a moment, looking out over the rooftops of Privet Drive, watching a pair of sparrows argue over something on a neighbor's television aerial. The number was not small. He folded the letter carefully, creased it along its original lines, and slid it back into the envelope. He looked at Hedwig, who had woken up during his silence and was now watching him with the particular quality of attention that owls have, head tilted slightly, amber eyes round and unblinking, as if she could hear something in his stillness that the room couldn't. "Don't worry," he said to her quietly. "I'm not angry." He paused. "Not yet." He heard Vernon's car pull into the drive about 40 minutes later. He must have dropped Dudley at practice early. Harry had the letter tucked under his mattress by then, between the floorboard and the box spring where he kept the photographs of his parents. He was back at the window with his book open, looking exactly like someone who had been reading all morning and hadn't received any post. The front door opened. He heard Vernon's shoes on the hall tiles, that particular flat-footed tread, and then the sound of the post being collected from the mat. There was a pause. A longer pause than usual. Harry kept his eyes on his book. Boy. The word came up through the ceiling like something thrown. Harry closed his book, came down the stairs at a normal pace, and found Vernon Dursley standing in the hallway with a look on his face that Harry had learned, over the years, to read fairly precisely. It wasn't the red-faced sputtering fury that meant Dudley had done something, that anger was almost performative, like Vernon was auditioning for the role of disappointed father. It wasn't the specific purple-tinged color that appeared whenever Harry did magic. This was something else. A tighter, more controlled expression. His mustache was very still. His eyes were watchful. He was holding an envelope. Also cream-colored. Also embossed with a copper G. "This came for you," Vernon said, and his voice was measured in a way that immediately told Harry it was the second letter from Gringotts, not a response to the first. Which meant the bank had sent two, one directly to him, and one through normal post. Which meant they'd anticipated exactly this kind of interception. Smart goblins. Is it? Harry said. Vernon's jaw tightened. Don't play the fool. You know perfectly well what bank this is. I don't touch anything from the freak post, Harry said, which was a lie he'd told enough times that it had started to feel like a reflex. He held out his hand. I'll take it. Something moved behind Vernon's eyes, a quick calculation, a door closing. I'll hold on to it. In case it requires a response from the head of the household. Harry looked at him for a moment. Not the way he might have looked at him a year ago, not with that particular swallowing sensation, the careful management of expression that had been so much a part of living in this house. He looked at Vernon Dursley the way you look at something you're trying to understand accurately before you make a decision about it. Uncle Vernon, he said, that letter is addressed to me. Legally, you don't have the right to hold my correspondence. You're a minor. Under my roof. I'm also the sole heir of an estate, Harry said, and watched Vernon's stillness become a different kind of stillness altogether. I think we both know what that letter says. 3 seconds of silence. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. A car went past outside. Vernon slid the letter into his trouser pocket. Go to your room, he said. Harry went. Not because he was told to, but because his room was where he needed to be, and there was nothing more to accomplish in the hallway right now. He sat on the edge of his bed, pulled the first letter out from under the mattress, and read through the list of disbursements again. The secondary account access had been granted to 2 parties. The first was listed only as executor, Dumbledore, APWB, which was a name Harry recognized, obviously, though the word executor sat beside it in a way that he'd never thought about before. The second recipient's name was listed with a Muggle address. Number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. He stared at that for a long time. Vernon Dursley had been receiving quarterly payments from the Potter Family Trust for 13 years. While Harry slept in a cupboard. While Harry wore Dudley's cast-off clothes and was told there was no money for school shoes. While Harry was fed the leftovers of leftovers and made to do the gardening and informed, repeatedly, that he was a burden, a charity case, a problem that decent people had been generous enough to absorb. He thought about the number at the bottom of the second page. Then he thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He pulled a piece of parchment toward him, uncapped his ink, and started writing, not a letter yet, but notes. A list. Everything the Gringotts letter had told him, organized by date, by amount, by name. Hermione had once told him that the first thing you do when you're building a case is establish what you actually know, and separate it clearly from what you assume. He wrote for almost an hour, filling both sides of the parchment, his handwriting getting smaller and neater as he concentrated. When he was done, he read through it once more. Then he wrote 3 letters. The first was to Hermione. Short, carefully worded, asking her to research something specific, the Wisengamot probate protocols and the legal standing of a 14-year-old magical heir under the Inheritance Act of 1797. He didn't explain why. Hermione would find out anyway, and she'd find out more thoroughly than he could ask for. The second was to Ron. Also short, asking him to talk to his father quietly, not about specifics, just about whether Arthur Weasley knew anything about standard executor arrangements for wizarding estates, and what oversight the ministry was supposed to provide. He knew Ron would push for more information. He wrote "I'll explain" in person and meant it. The third letter was the most carefully written of the three. It was addressed to Gringotts Bank, reference account 687, audit case 7741, P, attention senior account manager. It acknowledged receipt of the audit notice, formally requested a full accounting meeting at the claimant's earliest opportunity, and invoked, because the letter had mentioned he had this right and Harry had looked it up in the copy of Wizarding legal standards he kept under his loose floorboard, the heir's right of direct inquiry under the Potter Family Trust Charter, which meant the meeting could not be refused, delayed, or redirected through a third party. He sealed all three with wax, which Hedwig regarded with the mild disdain she reserved for things she found unnecessarily ceremonial. "Sorry," Harry said, pressing his thumb into the cooling wax. "I'm learning." He sent Hedwig out with all three just before dinner. Vernon's behavior at the dinner table that evening was a study in performance. He ate methodically, talked to Petunia about the neighbor's new car, complimented Dudley on something rugby-related, and pointedly did not look at Harry. The letter had not been mentioned again. It was still in his pocket. Harry could see the faint rectangular outline against the fabric of his trousers. Petunia watched Vernon in the way she always watched him when something was happening, with a careful, attentive quality that she disguised as ordinary attention. She'd always been the sharper of the two, Harry had decided years ago. Vernon was the one who made noise. Petunia was the one who watched. She looked at Harry once, briefly, and something moved across her face that he couldn't quite name. He ate his dinner. He said nothing. That night, lying on his back in the dark, he let himself think through it properly, not the legal mechanics of it, not the numbers, but the simple human reality. His parents had died when he was 15 months old. In the weeks that followed, while the wizarding world was celebrating and grieving and putting itself back together, someone had sat down and arranged things. Someone had decided where Harry would live, how the money would be handled, who would have access to what. Those decisions had been made by people who had not, apparently, consulted anyone about what was actually best for Harry. Or they had, and this was what best had looked like to them. He wasn't sure which possibility was more interesting. He thought about Dumbledore. Not with anger, not yet, though he suspected that was coming. He thought about Dumbledore the way he'd been learning to think about complex things lately, as a set of choices and motivations that needed to be understood accurately before they could be dealt with properly. Dumbledore was a man who believed in certain things deeply enough to arrange the world around those beliefs. Harry had always found that reassuring. He was starting to see how it could be something else. He fell asleep thinking about the number at the bottom of the second page, and in the morning he woke up still certain about what he was going to do. He spent the next 3 days very quietly. He helped with the garden without being asked. He cooked breakfast 2 mornings in a row. He answered questions in monosyllables and stayed out of Vernon's way so thoroughly that Petunia looked faintly unsettled by it, as if his compliance was more alarming than his usual careful distance. On the 4th day, Hermione's reply arrived. Hedwig brought it in just after 7 in the morning, while Vernon and Petunia were still in the kitchen. Harry was sitting on the stairs, ostensibly because he'd been coming down for breakfast, but actually because the stairs gave him a clear line of sight to the front door and the post slot, and he'd been doing this every morning since Tuesday. Hermione's letter was 8 pages. He read it all. She had, characteristically, not only answered his question but answered 5 adjacent questions he hadn't known to ask. The Wizengamot probate protocols, she wrote, were genuinely obscure, not taught at Hogwarts, not covered in any standard curriculum, which she found suspicious and worth noting, but they were clear on several key points that she had underlined in red ink. A wizarding heir who had reached the age of 13 could petition the Wizengamot probate office directly, without the intervention of a guardian, in cases where the estate in question had been subject to potential mismanagement. This was a protection built into the law specifically because guardians were, by definition, in a position of conflict when it came to their wards' estates. The petition required supporting documentation, an audit, ideally, and had to be filed in person or through an authorized Gringotts representative. Here Hermione had written, in capital letters, "Harry, this is already more than enough. Where did this come from? Are you all right? Please reply immediately." He smiled despite himself. She'd also included, because she was Hermione, a 3-page summary of the Inheritance Act of 1797 with relevant clauses bookmarked with little sticky notes. One of them said, "This one's important." The relevant clause specified that a minor heir's right to petition the probate office could not be blocked, stayed, or modified by any individual currently named as a beneficiary of the estate in question. Which meant Dumbledore, listed as executor and indirect beneficiary through the educational disbursements Harry had noted, could not legally stand in Harry's way once the petition was filed. Harry read that part twice. Then he folded Hermione's letter into his pocket, where it sat against his sternum for the rest of the day like something warm. Ron's reply came the following afternoon, scrawled on a piece of parchment that had clearly been written in a hurry. Ron's handwriting always got worse when he was excited, and this was very nearly illegible in places. "Harry, mate, Dad got a weird look on his face when I asked about executor arrangements, and I think it's the look he gets when he knows something he's not supposed to tell me. He said everything was properly managed, which is definitely the kind of thing Dad says when something wasn't properly managed at all. Also, Mum asked why I was asking about it, and I said it was for a school project, and she said, in summer, and I said it was optional, and she gave me the look. You need to tell me what's going on. I can handle it. Also, what's the Gringotts letter thing? Ginny saw the envelope on your owl and she's asking questions and I don't know what to tell her. Come to the burrow. Seriously. Come now." Harry reread the part about Arthur Weasley's look. Properly managed. He thought about that for a while. He'd already written back to Gringotts requesting a meeting at the earliest available date. The response had arrived this morning, slipped under his door before dawn by a very small, very efficient owl that had departed before he was fully awake, which was Goblin postal efficiency at its most impressive. The meeting was confirmed for Thursday at 11 o'clock. He was to come to the main entrance and ask for Ragnarok, Senior Account Manager, reference case 7741, p. He had 4 days. He spent them well. He reread Hermione's research until he could recite the relevant clauses without looking. He made a clean copy of his notes, organized by category, known facts, amounts, dates, names. He thought about what he wanted from this meeting, not emotionally, but practically. What did a good outcome look like? What did he need to walk out of Gringotts with? Evidence, first. Properly documented, Goblin-certified evidence. Not because he doubted the letter, but because a letter was an allegation. What he needed were records. Statements. The kind of documentation that could stand in front of a Wisengamot committee or a Muggle court without flinching. He thought about the Muggle court angle for a long time. Because that was the thing that no one would be expecting. The wizarding world had its own legal machinery, and Harry was beginning to understand that machinery fairly well. But Vernon Dursley wasn't a wizard. The money he'd received, however, it had moved between the Gringotts vault and his bank account, and Harry very much wanted to know how, had ultimately ended up in a very ordinary Muggle bank. Which meant it was subject to very ordinary Muggle financial law. Specifically, the laws around fraudulent receipt of funds from an estate, which Hermione had also covered in her letter under a section heading that said, "Just in case this is relevant, please tell me if it is." It was relevant. He packed a bag on Wednesday evening. Not everything, just what he needed. His notes, his wand, a change of clothes, the key to his Gringotts vault, the Gringotts letter, and the photograph of his parents that he always kept in his breast pocket anyway, the one where they're laughing at something outside the frame. He'd been at Privet Drive for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of Vernon's careful avoidance, of Petunia watching him like a puzzle, of Dudley being alternatively obnoxious and curiously absent. He ate dinner. He said goodnight to no one in particular. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and let himself feel, just for a minute, the thing he'd been keeping carefully in a box all week. He'd been lied to. Not once, not casually, but systematically, over years, by people who had arranged his world into a shape that served them and called it protection. His parents' money they had left for him, for his life, for the future they hadn't lived to give him, had been flowing out of his vault every quarter while he went to school in second-hand robes and was grateful for it. His uncle had cashed those checks. Had bought the car with them, maybe. Had paid for Dudley's school fees, his rugby kit, his ridiculous amount of birthday presents. Had sat at the dinner table across from Harry and talked about the burden of charity with the particular smugness of someone getting paid to perform it. Harry let himself feel all of that. He let it sit in his chest, bright and sharp and real. He didn't push it down, that was a habit he was done with, but he didn't let it make him reckless either. He let it settle into something that felt, by the time he closed his eyes, less like rage and more like clarity. In the morning, he was going to Gringotts. He got up at 6, dressed, ate a piece of toast standing in the kitchen, and wrote a note that he left on the kitchen table. Not an explanation, just a fact. Gone to London. Back by evening. H. He walked to the bus stop in the early morning quiet of Privet Drive, his bag over one shoulder, the sun still low and thin over the rooftops. The street looked the same as it always did, immaculate, identical, deeply committed to its own normalcy. Number 4 sat behind him, its net curtains still, its perfect lawn already beginning to need cutting again. He didn't look back at it. The bus into London was half empty. He sat by the window and watched the suburbs give way to the city's older, denser geometry, thought over his notes one more time, and felt something settle in him that he thought might be the sensation of moving in the right direction. He was going to find out exactly what had been done. He was going to have it documented and certified and legal. And then, calmly, methodically, and without drama, he was going to make it right. Not because he was owed it, though he was. Not because he was angry, though he had every right to be. But because he was Harry Potter, sole heir of the Potter family estate, and he had decided that that meant something. The bus rolled into London. Harry straightened in his seat, adjusted his bag, and checked the time. 20 minutes to Gringotts. He was ready. Chapter 2, Vaults and Verdicts. The Leaky Cauldron was quiet at 9:30 on a Thursday morning. Harry pushed through the door from the Muggle Street, the familiar smell of old wood and fire whiskey and something indefinably magical hitting him like a hand on the chest. Tom the barman was polishing glasses at the far end of the bar with the methodical patience of someone who had been doing it for a very long time and expected to be doing it for considerably longer. 2 witches in the corner were having what looked like an intense conversation over enormous cups of tea. Nobody looked up. Harry crossed to the back, tapped the brick sequence from memory, 3 up, 2 across, and stepped through into Diagon Alley as the wall folded itself politely aside. The alley at this hour was a different creature from the alley at the height of August, when Hogwarts families swarmed through it with lists and children and the particular stress of people who had left their school shopping too late. Now it was calm and businesslike, the shop owners sweeping their front steps, the owls and elops coasting from perch to perch in the warm light, the cobblestones still damp from some earlier rain. A witch in ministry robes was buying a newspaper. An old wizard was arguing gently with a set of self-measuring dress robes in a tailor's doorway. Harry walked straight down the middle of the alley, neither hurrying nor dawdling. He had his bag. He had his notes. He had 15 minutes before 11 o'clock and a very clear idea of what he needed. Gringotts rose at the far end of the street the way it always had, brilliant white marble, enormous, deliberately imposing in the way that banks everywhere seem to believe is necessary. The 2 goblins at the main doors watched him approach with the flat professional assessment that goblins gave everyone, which was different from the covert recognition stares he sometimes got in the alley. Goblins didn't care who you were famous for being. They cared what accounts you held. He pushed through the heavy bronze doors. Inside, the main hall was running at its usual controlled intensity, dozens of goblins behind the long counter, dozens of witches and wizards queuing or transacting or examining documents with varying degrees of comprehension. The ceiling soared above it all, indifferent and golden. The sound was a low, constant working hum, the noise of money and law moving together. Harry walked to the nearest free goblin and said, clearly and without preamble, "My name is Harry Potter. I have an 11 o'clock meeting with Ragnarok, Senior Account Manager, regarding Audit Case 7741-P. I'm a few minutes early." The goblin, young, by the look of it, though it was genuinely difficult to tell, looked at him for a moment, then at a ledger, then back at him. Something shifted in its expression, not surprise exactly, but a slight recalibration, as if it had been briefed but was still adjusting its expectations to the actual person standing in front of it. "One moment," it said, and disappeared through a door behind the counter. Harry stood and waited. He didn't fidget. He read the notices on the nearest wall, exchange rates, posting schedules, a framed copy of what appeared to be the Gringotts Charter from 1478, until a different goblin appeared, older, shorter, with the kind of face that had been carved into its current expression by decades of making exactly the kind of calculations that other people found uncomfortable. "Mr. Potter," the goblin said. "Not a question." "That's right. I am Ragnarok." No warmth in it, but no hostility either, just the flat precision of someone who had very little time for social performance. "You are early." "I find it useful to be early," Harry said. Something in Ragnarok's face shifted, microscopic, but Harry caught it. The goblin turned. "Follow me." They went through the door behind the counter, down a corridor that Harry had never seen before, not the usual route to the vaults, but something different, narrower, lined with what appeared to be filing systems that went from floor to ceiling and emitted a faint, orderly clicking sound, as if everything inside them was continuously cross-referencing itself. They passed 3 other goblins who all looked up briefly and then looked away, and then Ragnarok opened a door at the far end and led Harry into a room that was almost nothing like what he'd expected. It was smaller than he'd imagined. A round table with 3 chairs, 2 on one side and 1 on the other, a window that looked out onto some kind of interior courtyard where nothing was growing but the stone looked expensive. On the table was a folder, thick, banded with copper-colored metal clasps, embossed on the cover with the Potter account reference number. Ragnarok sat on the side with 2 chairs. Harry sat across from him. "I will begin," Ragnarok said, opening the folder, "by confirming that everything in the audit notice you received is accurate. The figures, the dates, and the names. I want to establish that before we proceed, because I am aware that what this file contains will be significant." He looked at Harry directly. "Are you prepared for that?" "Yes," Harry said. Ragnarok studied him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that suggested he was used to people saying yes and meaning something considerably less certain. Then he appeared to accept Harry's answer at face value and opened the folder. "The Potter Family Trust," he began, "was established by Fleamont and Euphemia Potter in 1963, and amended by your father, James Charles Potter, in September of 1979, 2 years before his death. The trust held, at the time of your parents' deaths in October 1981, a combined value across vault holdings, property, and invested assets of approximately 4,200,000 galleons." Harry had been prepared for a large number. He had not, quite, been prepared for that number. He kept his face still. "Go on." "At the time of your parents' deaths, the trust entered a period of managed holding, as specified in the charter, assets held in trust for the sole heir until point of majority, with provision for educational and personal expenses to be drawn against the principal account." Ragnarok turned a page. An executor was appointed through the standard Wiesengemot process. That executor was Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. "I know who he is." In November of 1981, Ragnarok continued, without acknowledging the interruption, Executor Dumbledore established a secondary disbursement arrangement on the trust. This arrangement authorized quarterly transfers from the trust to two designated recipients. He slid a page across the table. The first was listed as a personal expenses and discretionary management allowance, paid to Executor Dumbledore himself, a standard provision under the Executor's Fee Clause of the 1797 Inheritance Act. The total paid under this arrangement over 13 years amounts to approximately 14,000 galleons. Harry looked at the number on the page. It was large. It was also not what was bothering him. And the second arrangement, he said. Ragnarok turned another page. The second disbursement arrangement was established under a clause listed in the documentation as protective housing compensation, a clause which, I must inform you, does not exist in the Potter Family Trust Charter, was not authorized by any provision of the 1797 Act, and has no legal standing in Wiesengemot probate law. A pause. It was, to be plain, Ragnarok said, fabricated. Harry's hands were flat on the table. He was aware of them in a distant way, the way you're aware of your heartbeat when something shifts. How much? Quarterly payments of 150 galleons, beginning November 1981 and continuing until this audit was triggered 3 weeks ago. Ragnarok's expression was the careful neutrality of someone conveying information they find professionally repugnant. Over 13 years, at current exchange rates, and accounting for the quarterly accrual, the total disbursed to the Muggle recipient under this fraudulent arrangement is approximately 7,800 galleons. The Muggle recipient being Vernon Dursley. Correct. How was the money transferred? Harry asked. Gringotts to a Muggle bank account, how does that work? Ragnarok almost looked approving. An excellent question, and one that tells us something about how this was arranged. There are licensed conversion firms that handle magical to Muggle currency exchange, operating under ministry oversight. The disbursements from your account were converted quarterly to pound sterling, approximately £6,000 per transfer at the going rate, and deposited to an account at Barclays Bank in Little Whinging, Surrey, held in the name of Vernon Arthur Dursley. £6,000. Every 3 months. For 13 years. Harry did the maths without meaning to. It sat in his chest like a stone. Mr. Potter, Ragnarok said, and something in his voice had changed, not softer exactly, but more deliberate. I want to be clear about what Gringotts' position is in this matter. These disbursements were made from an account under our management. They were made under a fraudulent clause that should have been identified and rejected at the point of establishment. They were not. A pause that had weight in it. We failed in our oversight obligations, and the bank acknowledges this. This audit was triggered not by a routine review, but by a cross-referencing flag in our systems, which means it took 13 years longer to catch than it should have. Harry looked at him. Why are you telling me that? Because you should know it, Ragnarok said simply. And because Gringotts does not make a habit of hoping its clients won't notice our errors. The bank is prepared to refund the disbursements in full from our own reserves as an acknowledgement of our oversight failure, pending the legal resolution of the claim against the original recipients. The word refund sat on the table between them like something solid. I appreciate that, Harry said carefully. But I want to understand something first. The fraudulent clause, protective housing compensation, who created it? Who put it in the documentation? Ragnarok opened the folder to a section near the back and turned it to face Harry. The page was a reproduction of the original disbursement authorization form from November 1981. Harry looked at the signature at the bottom. The handwriting was unfamiliar, a formal, curling script that he'd only seen in official correspondence. But the name printed beneath it was not. APWB Dumbledore, Executor. Harry looked at it for a long time. He created the clause, Harry said. The documentation establishes that the disbursement arrangement was filed by the executor. Yes. Ragnarok's voice was careful here, scrupulously precise, which Harry appreciated. What we cannot establish from paperwork alone is whether Executor Dumbledore created the clause with intent to defraud, or whether he genuinely believed some legal justification existed for it. That distinction matters in terms of what claims can be brought against him personally. But against Vernon Dursley, Mr. Dursley received funds he had no legal entitlement to, disbursed from a trust he had no authorized relationship with, under a clause that had no legal basis. Ragnock's tone was entirely flat. His knowledge of the fraudulent nature of the arrangement is, for the purposes of a civil claim, largely irrelevant. He received money that was not his. He is liable for its return. Harry nodded slowly. What about criminal liability? In wizarding law, the receiving of fraudulently disbursed estate funds is a civil matter, primarily. However, Ragnock paused, and Harry had the impression this was not a spontaneous pause, that they'd been moving toward this point deliberately. In Muggle law, the receipt of funds obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation constitutes financial fraud. The relevant statute would be the Fraud Act 2006 and associated case law on estate fraud, which your Muggle legal counsel would be better positioned to advise on. What I can tell you is that Gringotts is prepared to provide certified documentation of all disbursements, amounts, dates, and conversion records to any court, Muggle or magical, that formally requests them. Harry sat back slightly. There it was. The piece he'd been turning over for days, the Muggle angle, the question of whether Gringotts would cooperate with a Muggle proceeding. The answer was yes. Not enthusiastically, maybe, but practically, legally, completely yes. Because money was money, and fraud was fraud, and goblins had been navigating the overlap between magical and Muggle financial law for centuries. I'd like the full audit report, Harry said. Everything you've shown me today, plus the original trust charter, the disbursement authorization forms, the conversion records, and a certified statement from Gringotts confirming the fraudulent nature of the protective housing compensation clause. Ragnock reached into the folder and produced a document that was already prepared, already sealed with the bank's copper stamp. He slid it across the table. We anticipated the request, he said. Harry took it. What else should I know? Several things. Ragnock settled back. The Potter estate, beyond the vault holdings, includes property assets. Specifically, a family home in Godric's Hollow, which is uninhabitable in its current state but retains significant land value. A cottage in Wales registered under the trust. And a townhouse in London's Marylebone district, which has been under a management letting arrangement since 1982 and is currently generating rental income that has been accruing, correctly, in this case, to the trust. Harry blinked. There's a house in London. There are 3 properties in total, Ragnock said. The trust charter specifies that all property decisions are at the heir's discretion from the age of majority, which in wizarding law is 17. However, as you are engaging the probate process directly and have invoked the heir's right of direct inquiry, you have a right to full information regarding all estate holdings regardless of your current age. What's the trust's current value? Harry asked. After the disbursements. Ragnock consulted the folder. At current assessment, the liquid vault holdings stand at approximately 3,900,000 galleons. The property portfolio adds an estimated 400,000. The Gringotts reimbursement, when processed, will restore a further sum equivalent to the fraudulent disbursements. He paused. You are not, Mr. Potter, without resources. No. He was very much not. He thought, briefly and with a sharp, clean kind of clarity, about every time he'd been told there wasn't money for things. Every time he'd worn clothes that didn't fit because buying new ones was out of the question. Every time the Dursleys had eaten well and Harry had eaten whatever was left and been made to feel grateful for it. He thought about those things for exactly as long as it took to feel them clearly, and then he set them aside. I want to ask about the executor arrangement, Harry said. Dumbledore's role. Under the trust charter, what authority does the executor have over estate decisions? Considerable authority, in normal circumstances, Ragnock said. An executor manages the trust until the heir reaches majority, overseeing investments, approving significant expenditures, managing property. They are, functionally, in control of the estate during the trust period. And what happens to that authority if the executor is found to have acted outside the charter's provisions? Ragnar's expression didn't change, but there was something in it, a quality of attention, precise and sharp. If a Wisingamot probate hearing determines that the executor acted in breach of the charter, their authority can be suspended pending the hearing's outcome. Any ongoing decisions they make from the point the breach claim is filed would be held in abeyance until the matter is resolved. So if I file the probate petition tomorrow, Harry said, Dumbledore's executor authority is effectively frozen while the claim is under review. Effectively, yes. Including his authority to make decisions about where I live and who has legal guardianship of me. A pause. Ragnar looked at him with something that, on a goblin face, came fairly close to respect. That is a correct reading of the relevant provisions. Harry picked up the certified audit document and put it in his bag. I'll need something else, he said. A letter of standing. Something on official Gringotts stationery confirming that I am the sole heir of the Potter estate, that I have invoked the heir's right of direct inquiry, and that I am engaged in active probate proceedings. I'll need it for the ministry filing. Ragnar produced that too. Also already prepared. You were thorough, Harry said, looking at it. We have been waiting, Ragnar said, for some time, for someone to ask the right questions. Harry looked up at that. There was something in the goblin's voice, not quite regret, nothing as vulnerable as that, but something adjacent to it. As if Ragnar had looked at the Potter account for years, at the steady quarterly flow of money out of it, and found it professionally unsatisfying in a way that was also slightly personal. How long have you been the account manager? Harry asked. I was assigned to the Potter account in 1984, Ragnar said. 3 years after your parents' deaths. And the disbursement arrangement was already in place by then. Yes. Did you review it when you took over the account? A pause. Not evasive, considering. I reviewed the file. The disbursement arrangement was listed under executor's authority, which has a broad mandate under the 1797 Act. I noted the protective housing compensation clause as unusual, but did not at that time investigate further. He stopped. That was an error in judgment. Harry looked at him for a moment. I appreciate you saying that. Ragnar inclined his head, the smallest possible acknowledgement, but it was genuine. I'm going to ask one more thing, Harry said. And I want to be clear that this is a request, not a demand. If it's not possible, I'll understand. Ragnar waited. When I file the probate petition, I'd like a Gringotts representative to be present at the ministry hearing. Someone with authority to speak to the audit findings and certify the documentation. Not as my advocate, just as a witness to the bank's records. Ragnar was quiet for 3 full seconds. Gringotts does not typically engage with ministry proceedings, he said. I know. It would be unusual. It would, Harry agreed. It would also be, I think, in the bank's interest to demonstrate that it takes estate fraud seriously and cooperates fully when it's brought to light. Particularly given that the fraudulent arrangement ran for 13 years under your management. The silence stretched. I will be present at the ministry hearing, Ragnar said. Personally. Harry nodded. He stood, picked up his bag, and held out his hand across the table. Ragnar looked at it for a moment. Goblins, Harry knew, had their own greeting customs, and then reached out and shook it. His grip was dry and very firm. Mr. Potter, Ragnar said, you are better prepared than I expected. I've had a good week, Harry said. He walked back out through the clicking corridors, through the main hall with its working hum of money and law, through the bronze doors and down the white marble steps. Diagon Alley was busier now, the morning well underway, the alley filling with the normal mid-morning traffic of wizarding commerce. The sun was properly up, pressing warmth into the cobblestones. Harry stood on the steps for a moment with his bag on his shoulder and the certified Gringotts audit in his hand. He had what he'd come for. The numbers, the names, the certified documentation of exactly what had been done and by whom. He had the fraudulent clause in Dumbledore's handwriting. He had the transfer record showing 13 years of quarterly payments to Vernon Dursley's Barclays account. He had a Gringotts representative committed to appearing at the ministry hearing. And he had something else, something the meeting had given him that he hadn't quite been expecting. Not comfort, exactly. But confirmation. Confirmation that the world he was dealing with was legible, that it operated by rules that could be understood and used, and that the people who had arranged his life the way they had done so in ways that were traceable, documentable, and answerable for. He was going to file the probate petition tomorrow. He was going to write to Hermione tonight with the full details and ask her to review his filing draft. He was going to write to a Muggle solicitor, he'd already found a name, through the kind of careful library research that no one at Privet Drive would notice, about the fraud complaint against Vernon. And at some point, probably soon, he was going to have a conversation with Albus Dumbledore. He was looking forward to it, in the particular way that you look forward to something you've prepared carefully for. The morning was warm and clear, and Harry Potter walked back up Diagon Alley with the settled, purposeful ease of someone who knew exactly what the next move was. He bought a pasty from a bakery he passed on the way, because he'd skipped breakfast and because some things were simple, and ate it on the steps of the leaky cauldron while writing out the skeleton of tonight's letter to Hermione. The parchment balanced on his knee, the ink catching the light, and his handwriting was neater than usual, the handwriting of someone who was thinking clearly. The pasty was excellent. Hermione's letter was thorough. The day ahead was organized and deliberate. He was not a boy waiting for someone to tell him what to do. He was Harry Potter, sole heir of the Potter estate, in possession of a certified Gringotts audit and a very comprehensive understanding of the relevant Wisengamot probate law. And tomorrow, he was going to the ministry. Chapter 3, 2 Courts. One morning the solicitor's office was on a narrow street in Clerkenwell that looked like it had been quietly resisting modernization since approximately 1987. The buildings on either side were glass and steel, all clean lines and corporate confidence, but number 14 sat between them like a man who'd been asked to move and had simply declined. The brass plate beside the door said Aldridge and Fenn, solicitors, estate and probate law in letters that had gone green at the edges from decades of London weather. Harry pushed the door open at 9:15. The woman at the front desk looked up. She had the expression of someone who had been working in law long enough to be unsurprised by most things, and she applied this expression to Harry, 14, slightly travel-worn, carrying a bag that clinked faintly with rolled parchment, with admirable neutrality. "I have an appointment," Harry said. "Harry Potter, 9:30, with Ms. Fenn. She's expecting you. Have a seat." He sat in a chair that was older than he was and read the framed certificates on the wall while he waited. Margaret Fenn had been practicing estate and probate law for 22 years. She'd done her training at Gray's Inn. There was a letter of commendation from some organization Harry didn't recognize but which had an impressive number of words in its name. He'd found her through the legal directory at Islington Public Library, which he'd used on a Wednesday afternoon while telling the Dursleys he was at the park. He'd looked for someone who specialized specifically in cross-jurisdictional estate cases, not a common specialty, and Aldridge and Fenn had come up twice in the relevant search results, once in connection with a case involving a disputed foreign inheritance and once in a legal journal article about estate fraud detection that Ms. Fenn had apparently written herself. Someone who wrote journal articles about estate fraud detection seemed like exactly the right person to call. "Mr. Potter." A woman had appeared in the doorway to the inner office, mid-40s, compact, with sharp dark eyes and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at him with the same professional recalibration the Gringotts goblin had performed, adjusting expectation to reality. "Come through." Her office was the organized chaos of someone doing serious work, files and labeled stacks, a whiteboard covered in case reference numbers, 2 computers that both appeared to be running simultaneously. She sat behind her desk and gestured Harry to the chair opposite, and the moment he was seated she said, "Your letter was interesting." "In a good way or a legally problematic way?" "Both, potentially." She folded her hands. "You said in your letter that you have documentation of fraudulent disbursements from an estate account to a Muggle bank." "I do." He produced the Gringotts documentation from his bag, the certified audit, the conversion records, the fraudulent clause authorization, all of it sealed with the copper Gringotts stamp. He laid it on her desk. She looked at the seal. This is a bank document. It's from my family's bank, yes. The letterhead says Gringotts. She looked up. I'm not familiar with Gringotts. Private bank, Harry said. Old institution. Very thorough record keeping. She accepted this and opened the document. Harry watched her read. She was fast, the eye movements of someone who processed legal text the way other people processed conversation. Her expression didn't change much, but he noticed when she reached the disbursement figures, a slight tightening around her eyes. And when she reached the Barclays account records, she went still for a moment. These are Barclays transfers, she said, looking up. Yes. Quarterly. 13 years. Yes. And the account holder is, Vernon Arthur Dursley, Harry said. My mother's sister's husband. My legal guardian. Ms. Fenn put the document down on her desk and looked at Harry with an expression that had shifted from professional assessment to something more direct. Mr. Potter. How old are you? 14. And you found this documentation yourself? With help. From whom? My bank's account management team. He paused. And a friend who's very good at legal research. Ms. Fenn was quiet for a moment. She picked up the document again and turned to the conversion records, pages of quarterly transfers, each one showing the amount in galleons, the pound sterling equivalent, the conversion date, and the destination account number at Barclays. She went through every page. Harry waited. This is organized, she said, when she'd finished. Someone put significant effort into making this fraudulent arrangement look legitimate. Yes. Which tells me it wasn't impulsive. This was a deliberate, long-term financial arrangement. She looked at him. The original authorization, who signed it? The estate executor. A third party. Harry had thought carefully about how to handle this part. The magical world's involvement needed to be handled delicately with a Muggle solicitor, not hidden, because he needed her to understand the full picture, but framed in terms that were legally coherent in a Muggle context. The executor established the disbursement arrangement through the bank. The clause authorizing the payments to my guardian was, according to my bank's audit, not supported by any legitimate provision in my family's trust charter. They've certified it as fraudulent. Is the executor also potentially liable? That's a separate matter I'm pursuing through separate channels, Harry said. For your purposes, the relevant question is Vernon Dursley, specifically, his receipt of approximately £300,000 of estate funds over 13 years without legal entitlement. Ms. Fenn's eyebrows went up. She'd done the maths. 300,000. Approximately. The exact figure in sterling is on page 4. She turned to page 4. Read the figure. And during this period, she said carefully, you were living with Mr. Dursley as his ward. Yes. Were you provided for? Adequately? Harry looked at her steadily. I slept in a cupboard under the stairs for the first 10 years. After that I had a bedroom. He kept his voice flat. Not performing the emotion, just stating the fact. I wore second-hand clothes and was told repeatedly that my care was a financial burden on the family. The silence in the office was the specific quality of silence that follows something that doesn't need to be elaborated on. All right, Ms. Fenn said, and she was writing now, fast and precise. Here is what I can tell you. Under the Fraud Act 2006, the fraudulent receipt of funds, knowingly or through deliberate ignorance, constitutes a criminal offense. The civil recovery options are also significant. We would need to establish that Mr. Dursley had reason to know the funds were not legitimately his, which, given the documentation here, is achievable. Would you take the case? She looked at him. I'd need to verify the bank documentation independently, confirm that the Barclays account exists, that the transfers occurred as stated. Standard due diligence. That should be straightforward, Harry said. The Barclays records are public in the sense that a court could access them. And Gringotts has confirmed they'll cooperate with any formal request for documentation. You've already spoken to your bank about cooperation with Muggle proceedings? Yes. She looked at him for another moment. Yes, she said finally. I'll take the case. My fee structure is, I can pay, Harry said. Whatever your standard rate is. Another recalibration. I'll have my assistant send you the engagement letter this week. She made a note. Mr. Potter, a question, and you don't have to answer it. Why are you doing this? You could, presumably, simply remove yourself from your guardian's household through normal channels. Why criminal fraud charges? Harry considered the question honestly, because it was an honest question and Ms. Fenn had earned a real answer. Because what was done was wrong, he said. Not just to me. What Vernon Dursley did, taking that money, knowing it came from my parents' estate, and then making me feel like a burden while he cashed the checks, that doesn't just get walked away from. He needs to be accountable for it. That's what courts are for. Ms. Fenn looked at him for a long moment. How very legally correct of you, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite dry humor but was adjacent to it. I've been reading, Harry said. He left Aldridge and Fenn at 10:30, walked back toward the tube with his bag lighter by a folder of copies he'd left with Ms. Fenn and heavier by a business card and the beginning of something that felt, satisfyingly, like unstoppable forward motion. He ate a sandwich on the tube to the ministry entrance, which was, as always, accessed through a phone box on a street in Westminster that Harry had now used enough times to stop finding it slightly absurd, and emerged into the Ministry of Magic's atrium at noon, exactly when he'd intended to. The atrium was doing its usual impression of organized governmental grandeur, the fountain with the golden statues in the center, the fireplaces along the wall belching green flames as witches and wizards arrived and departed, the ceiling showing some kind of atmospheric hex that currently had it looking like a perfect summer sky. The security desk was to his left. Harry went to the security desk, handed over his wand for weighing, and said, I'm here to file a petition with the Wisengamot probate office. I have an appointment with the duty clerk at noon. The security wizard wrote his name in the register, handed him a badge that said Harry Potter, probate filing, visitor, and pointed him toward the lifts. The probate office was on level 4, between the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures and what the lift announced as the Committee on Experimental Charms. It was smaller than Harry had expected, a suite of 3 rooms behind a frosted glass door, staffed by 2 witches and a wizard who all appeared to be drowning quietly in paperwork and managing it with varying degrees of grace. The duty clerk was a woman named Edith Lowry, who appeared to be somewhere between 60 and ancient, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck that she consulted frequently. She looked at Harry when he sat down across from her desk with the expression of someone who had not been expecting to see Harry Potter in her office today and was taking a moment to update her worldview. Mr. Potter, she said. Your appointment. Ms. Lowry, Harry said. He placed the Gringotts documentation on the desk, along with a handwritten petition that he had drafted and that Hermione had spent 2 days reviewing and annotating until it was, in her words, airtight. I'm here to file a Wisengamot probate petition under the heir's right of direct inquiry. Account reference 687, Potter Family Trust. I believe you'll find the filing complete. Edith Lowry picked up the petition and read it. She read it more slowly than Ms. Fenn had, in the way of someone who was parsing each clause for procedural compliance rather than legal argument, and Harry watched her go through it with the careful patience of someone who had prepared thoroughly and knew it. She reached the section where Hermione had inserted the clause about executor suspension. Her fingers stopped on the line. You're requesting suspension of executor authority pending hearing, she said. As provided under the Inheritance Act, Section 14, Clause 7, Harry said. Where a breach of trust is alleged and supported by certified documentation. I see that. She looked up at him. This would apply to Executor Dumbledore's authority. It would apply to whoever is listed as executor, yes. Edith Lowry put the petition down. She looked at him over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who had spent 40 years in a bureaucratic institution and had a very accurate sense of exactly how much political weight was about to descend on her office. "Mr. Potter, I have to tell you that a petition of this kind, involving an executor of Professor Dumbledore's standing, will attract significant attention." "I expect it will," Harry said pleasantly. "The head of this office will need to be notified." "Of course. And the hearing, if the petition is accepted, will be before a full probate committee." "That's what I want," Harry said. "I want a full hearing, on the record, with all documentation certified and entered into the official record. I want everything done completely by the book. If the petition is accepted, that is." He let that last part sit. Not a threat, just an acknowledgement that he knew how these offices worked, and that he was prepared for it to go either way procedurally, which meant he was prepared to push back if it went wrong. Edith Lowry looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the petition again, shuffled it together with the Gringotts documentation, and stamped both with the probate office seal. "Petition accepted for review," she said. "You'll receive written confirmation within 3 working days. The review period is 14 days, after which a hearing date will be set if the petition meets threshold." She paused. "Given the certified bank documentation and the Gringotts audit, I expect it will meet threshold." "Thank you," Harry said. "Does anyone know you're doing this?" she asked, and it wasn't a procedural question, it was a human one, slightly startled out of her official register. "A few people," Harry said. He stood, picked up his bag, and gave her a smile that was entirely genuine. "I appreciate your help, Ms. Lowry." He was in the lift heading back to the atrium when he heard it, his name, from the direction of the corridor behind him, spoken in a voice he recognized immediately. He pressed the lift button. The doors began to close. "Harry," he watched through the narrowing gap as Percy Weasley, red-faced, slightly breathless, clearly having just come from somewhere else in the building, stopped in the corridor and stared at the closing lift doors. The lift closed. Harry leaned against the wall as the lift descended and thought about Percy Weasley, who had a job in the ministry and would now, within the hour, know that Harry Potter had filed a probate petition naming Albus Dumbledore as a potentially breaching executor. Which meant that within the day, either Dumbledore would know, or Molly Weasley would, which was functionally the same thing. That was fine. Better than fine, actually. The petition was filed. It was stamped. It was in the system. Nothing anyone could say now would undo the procedural fact of its existence, and the executor suspension request was already in motion. The machinery had started turning. He came out into the atrium, collected his wand from security, and nearly walked straight into Amelia Bones. He recognized her from the ministry photographs in The Prophet, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a monocle and the bearing of someone who didn't need a room to go quiet when they walked in because the room tended to do it anyway. She was head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and she was looking at him with an expression that suggested the meeting was not entirely accidental. "Mr. Potter," she said. "A word?" "Of course," Harry said. They stood to one side of the atrium, away from the foot traffic of the fireplaces. Amelia Bones crossed her arms and looked at him with the direct, assessing quality of someone who had spent a career determining very quickly whether people were telling the truth. "I was informed this morning that a probate petition was being filed today by a minor claimant against the Potter estate," she said. "I made a point of being available. I hope you don't mind the coincidence." "Not at all," Harry said, and he meant it. "I won't pretend," she said, "that this situation is straightforward from a department standpoint. Executor Dumbledore is," she paused, choosing her word with precision, "influential. Any proceeding involving him will attract political pressure from multiple directions." "I know," Harry said. "That's why I've made sure the petition is procedurally perfect. Certified documentation, statutory filing, correct clauses cited. There's no legitimate procedural basis for rejecting it." Bones looked at him steadily. "You've thought about this carefully." "I've thought about not much else for 2 weeks. How old are you?" 14. Good Lord, she said, quietly and not unkindly. She unfolded her arms. The DMLE doesn't have a formal role in probate proceedings. But we do have oversight responsibility for estate fraud under the Magical Financial Crimes Act. If the Gringotts audit establishes fraudulent disbursements, and I'm told it does, that falls within my department's purview. So you're saying there could be a parallel DMLE investigation, Harry said. I'm saying there will be, she said. As a matter of proper procedure, not as a favor to you. I understand the distinction, Harry said. And I appreciate it. She looked at him for another moment. You said you've thought about not much else for 2 weeks. Have you had any help with this? A friend who's good at legal research, Harry said. And a very good account manager at my bank. No adult guidance. No magical guardian walking you through this? No. He kept his voice even. The adults who were supposed to guide me through things like this were the ones who had signed the fraudulent arrangement. The atrium noise moved around them. Amelia Bones looked at him with an expression that went through several stages: professional assessment, something that was possibly anger at the situation rather than at him, and finally a kind of settled respect that she didn't try to perform. The hearing, when it's scheduled, she said, will be before the probate committee. Normally that committee has 5 members. Given the political nature of this petition, there will be calls to seat members favorable to Executor Dumbledore. I want you to know that I'll be monitoring the composition of that committee closely. Thank you, Harry said. She nodded once, replaced her monocle, and walked away toward the lifts with the purposeful stride of someone with a full afternoon ahead of them. Harry stood in the middle of the ministry atrium for a moment, in the golden light under the artificial summer sky, and took stock. Muggle fraud complaint, filed and accepted. Gringotts documentation, certified and in Ms. Fenn's hands. Ministry probate petition, stamped and in the system, with executor suspension request in motion. DMLE interest, confirmed and monitoring. Amelia Bones, on his side, procedurally if not personally. The machine was running. He thought about the people who hadn't been told yet. Hermione knew most of it, Ron knew pieces. The Weasleys would know by tonight through Percy. Dumbledore probably by morning. And Vernon Dursley, sitting in number 4 Privet Drive, still holding that intercepted Gringotts letter in his pocket, still performing the comfortable certainty of a man who had never been called to account for anything. Not for long. Harry crossed the atrium, stepped into the fireplace with a handful of flow powder, said leaky cauldron, and was swallowed by green fire. He arrived back in Diagon Alley mid-afternoon, bought a bottle of ink and a new quill because he'd gone through both faster than expected this week, and sat at a corner table in the leaky cauldron to write to Hermione. He told her everything: the Muggle solicitor meeting, the probate filing, Amelia Bones. He wrote it clearly and in order, the way she liked, so she could track the procedural progress. He knew she'd read it at least twice and probably annotate it. He knew that somewhere in the margins she'd write something like excellent work and then feel embarrassed that she had, and he also knew that Ron, who would almost certainly be reading over her shoulder, would find it and tease her about it. He was halfway through the letter when his hand stopped. He was thinking about Dumbledore. Not the legal question of him, he'd handled that. The petition was filed, the clause was documented, the suspension request was in motion. The legal question of Dumbledore was, as much as these things could be, underway. He was thinking about the man himself. The way he'd always looked at Harry, fond, attentive, carrying some private weight. Harry had always found that weight comforting, the sense that Dumbledore was holding something serious on his behalf, taking care of something Harry was too young to understand. He'd never thought to ask what the weight actually was. He knew now that part of it, at least, was guilt. He picked up his quill and finished the letter to Hermione. He sealed it, borrowed an owl from the leaky cauldron's post box, and sent it. Then he sat for a minute in the low golden afternoon light of the pub, his empty cup in front of him, listening to the murmur of conversations around him, and let himself feel the weight of what he'd set in motion today. Not second-guessing it. Not softening it. Just feeling the full shape of it, the way you're supposed to feel things when they're real. He'd filed in 2 courts today. He'd spoken to a DMLE head. He'd started the legal process that would, in time, result in Vernon Dursley being investigated for financial fraud by the Metropolitan Police and simultaneously examined under the Muggle Fraud Act by a civil court. He'd started the process that would, in time, result in Albus Dumbledore appearing before a Wisengamot probate committee to explain a clause he'd invented in 1981 and signed his name to. He was 14 years old, he'd had a long day, and the pasty place in Diagon Alley was still open. He stood up, slung his bag over his shoulder, and went to get something to eat. Outside, London moved around him in the early evening, Muggle London, ordinary and enormous and indifferent, full of people living their lives in the way that people do when no one has arranged their world without asking them. Harry walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his mind already moving forward, already on the next thing. The petition was filed. The clock was running. And tomorrow, when he got back to Privet Drive, Vernon Dursley would be sitting in his armchair watching television, unaware that 2 different legal systems in 2 different worlds had today been handed a very clean, very complete, very devastating paper trail that ended at his front door. Harry thought about that the whole way home. He didn't smile exactly. But it was close. Chapter 4, on the record. The hearing notice arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after the petition was filed. Harry was in the back garden at Privet Drive, ostensibly pulling weeds from between Petunia's roses, actually reading a copy of the Wisengamot procedure manual that Hermione had sourced from somewhere and sent along with a 14-page summary that was itself more thorough than most books Harry had read. He heard the owl before he saw it, that same businesslike wing beat, the Gringotts bird, but this time accompanied by a second owl, smaller and ministry grey, both descending together as if they'd coordinated their arrival. He took both letters, folded them into his back pocket, finished the row of weeds with entirely unnecessary thoroughness, and went upstairs. The ministry letter confirmed what Edith Lowry had said it would. The petition had met threshold, a hearing date had been set for Friday of the following week before the full Wisengamot probate committee, and Harry was required to appear in person as the petitioning claimant. The committee composition was listed at the bottom, 5 members, all named. Harry didn't recognize 4 of them. The 5th was Griselda Marchbanks, who he knew from Hermione's research as someone who'd been examining Hogwarts students since before Dumbledore himself was a student, famously impartial, famously unbribable, famously the kind of witch who had outlived several attempts to pressure her into various things and appeared to find each attempt mildly entertaining. Good. The Gringotts letter was from Ragnarok, confirming his attendance at the hearing and informing Harry that the bank had prepared a formal testimony document, certified under the Gringotts Charter, which meant it carried the same legal weight in a Wisengamot proceeding as a sworn statement, attesting to the audit findings, the fraudulent clause, and the disbursement history. It would be entered into the record. Harry sat on his bed and wrote 3 letters in quick succession. The first to Hermione, hearing is Friday the 14th, full committee. Marchbanks is on it. Can you come? The second to Ron, same. Where's something that isn't covered in something? The third to Ragnarok, confirmed. Thank you. He sent them, lay back on his bed, and stared at the ceiling for approximately 45 seconds before sitting up again and getting back to Hermione's summary of the Wisengamot procedure manual. He had 8 days. He used them. Every morning he read. Every afternoon he wrote drafts of his oral statement, which he revised until the language was clean and precise without being cold, until it told the truth about what had happened in the order it had happened without performing emotion at the committee or begging for their sympathy. He didn't want their sympathy. He wanted their legal ruling. Hermione's reply arrived the next morning, and it said of course I'm coming in letters that were slightly larger than her usual handwriting and was followed by 4 pages of additional research on probate committee procedure, the rules of evidence for certified bank documentation, and a section she'd labeled things they might try and how to respond to them that Harry read 3 times and committed largely to memory. Ron's reply said obviously and then also Mum is losing her mind a bit, and then, after a gap that suggested he'd thought about whether to include the next part, Dumbledore came for dinner last night. Dad went very quiet. I'll tell you the rest in person. That last line sat with Harry for a while. He didn't know what Dumbledore had said at that dinner. He could guess at some of it, that Harry was acting impulsively, that he didn't understand the full picture, that there were reasons for the arrangements that hadn't been explained to him yet but that were for his protection, that the petition could be damaging in ways Harry wasn't equipped to foresee. He could guess at all of it because he knew how Dumbledore talked, and he knew that the man was genuinely skilled at making the shape of his decisions sound like wisdom. He was prepared for that conversation. He'd been preparing for it since the morning he'd read the Gringotts' letter on his windowsill. The morning of the hearing, Harry was up at 6. He dressed carefully, not formally, but deliberately. Clean clothes that fit him, which was a relatively recent development given that he'd used a portion of his vault funds to buy actual clothes his own size over the past 2 weeks, a decision that had caused Petunia to look at him sideways with an expression he couldn't entirely read. He packed his bag with the original Gringotts' letter, his copies of all the documentation, his petition draft, and Hermione's procedure notes. He ate breakfast standing at the kitchen counter, said nothing to Vernon, who was pointedly reading the newspaper with the specific concentration of a man pretending nothing was happening, and left the house at 7:15. He met Hermione and Ron at the Leaky Cauldron at 8, and the moment he walked through the door he felt something shift in his chest, the specific relief of having the people you trust most actually present in the same physical space. Hermione was already at a table with a folder in front of her, her hair slightly wild from what appeared to have been a very focused morning. She looked up when Harry came in and said, immediately, "How are you feeling?" "Ready," Harry said. "Good." She pushed the folder toward him. "I've updated the procedure notes with everything I found last night about Marchbanks. She has a history of very direct questioning and she doesn't give credit for emotional appeals, so keep everything grounded in the documentation." "Which you know, but I wanted to say it." "I know," Harry said. "Thanks." Ron, who was eating toast with the focused energy of someone fueling for a long day, looked at Harry and said, "You look like yourself." "That's a strange thing to say." "You look like yourself and you're not nervous," Ron clarified. "You're usually at least a bit nervous before things." Harry sat down. "I have certified documentation, a goblin witness, an impartial committee chair, and your sister's legal research. What's there to be nervous about?" "About 50 things," Hermione said automatically, and then, "but none of them are ones you haven't prepared for." Ron pointed at her with his toast. "That's the most Hermione sentence you've ever said." Hermione ignored this magnificently. They went through the procedure notes one more time over tea, Harry asking questions, Hermione answering them with the efficiency of someone who had been looking forward to being asked, Ron making occasional observations that were less legally rigorous but often surprisingly accurate about the human dynamics of the situation. It was, Harry thought, the best possible way to spend an hour before a Wisengamot hearing. They arrived at the ministry at 9:30. The atrium was busier than usual, it was a Friday, and there was apparently some interdepartmental conference happening on level 1 that had the fireplaces backed up. Harry collected his visitor badge, Harry Potter, probate hearing, petitioner, and led them to the lifts. Ragnarok was waiting outside courtroom 7 on level 2 when they arrived, standing with 2 other goblins who carried matching document cases and radiated the professional composure of entities who appeared in legal proceedings regularly and had never once been impressed by the architecture. He inclined his head at Harry. "Mr. Potter. You are on time." "So are you," Harry said. He introduced Hermione and Ron briefly. Ragnarok looked at Hermione for a moment, taking in the folder under her arm, the precise posture, the alert expression. "You prepared the petition draft," Ragnarok said. "Not a question." Hermione blinked. "I helped review it." The clause citations in Section 3 were unusually thorough for a first-time filing. He turned back toward the courtroom door. "It was good work." Hermione stood very still for a second with the expression of someone receiving unexpected praise from a quarter they deeply respect and not entirely knowing what to do with it. Ron pressed his lips together to avoid grinning. They went in. Courtroom 7 was smaller than the main Wisengamot chamber, which Harry knew from his hearing last year, but it was still formal enough to make its intentions clear. High benches for the committee arranged in a shallow arc, a central floor for the parties, document tables on either side, enchanted recording quills already moving at a stand near the door. The room was stone and wood and the particular quality of gravity that rooms accumulate when serious things have been decided in them for a long time. Harry took his place at the left table. Ragnock stood beside him. Hermione and Ron settled in the gallery. The committee filed in at 10 o'clock precisely. Griselda Marchbanks was first, small, ancient, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose body required more consultation than it once had but whose mind clearly did not. She sat in the center seat and looked immediately at Harry with bright, slightly disconcerting sharpness. The other 4 members arranged themselves. Harry assessed them quickly against Hermione's notes. 2 he identified as career civil servants, likely to follow procedural precedent. 1 was a Wisengamot elder whose voting record on estate matters was conservative but honest. The 4th was the one Hermione had flagged, a wizard named Tiberius Ogden, old family, known to be friendly with Dumbledore, whose presence on this committee Amelia Bones had apparently also noticed because Hermione had included a note that said Bones submitted a written objection to his inclusion, which was overruled. Watch him. Harry had been watching him since he sat down. Ogden was in his 60s, white-haired, with the kind of comfortable authority that comes from having always been in rooms where the decisions go your way. He glanced at Harry once, briefly, without expression, and then looked at the documents in front of him. Marchbanks called the hearing to order with a single rap of a small wooden gavel. Probate Petition 7741, p., she said, in a voice that carried without being raised. Petitioner Harry James Potter, represented personally, in the matter of alleged breach of trust by executor Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, and fraudulent disbursement from the Potter Family Trust. She looked at Harry. Mr. Potter, this is your petition. You may open. Harry stood. He'd rehearsed this. Not to the point of making it mechanical, he wasn't reading from a script, just speaking from what he knew, in the order it mattered, as clearly as he could. On the 22nd of June, he began, I received a formal audit notice from Gringotts Bank regarding my family's estate. The audit identified a disbursement arrangement established in November 1981, 2 months after my parents' deaths, that included a clause titled, Protective Housing Compensation. This clause authorized quarterly payments from the Potter Family Trust to a Muggle recipient, Vernon Arthur Dursley of Little Whinging, Surrey, over a period of 13 years. The total disbursed under this arrangement is approximately 7,800 galleons, converted to approximately £300,000. He paused. The Gringotts audit has certified that this clause does not exist in the Potter Family Trust Charter, was not authorized by any provision of the 1797 Inheritance Act, and has no legal standing in Wisengamot probate law. He placed the certified audit document on the committee's evidence table. The disbursement arrangement was filed and signed by the estate executor, Albus Dumbledore. His signature appears on the original authorization form, which is included in the certified documentation. He placed that too. I am asking this committee to formally declare the Protective Housing Compensation Clause fraudulent, order the recovery of all disbursed funds, and impose the executor suspension provided under Section 14, Clause 7 of the Inheritance Act, pending this committee's full determination. He sat down. Marchbanks looked at the documentation. The recording quills scratched. The committee members read. Tiberius Ogden looked up twice during the reading, once at Harry, once at the door, as if he was checking something. The door opened while they were still reviewing. Harry had known this was a possibility. Hermione had put it in her notes under the heading if he attends and had outlined, in precise detail, exactly what the procedural rules were about a named executor's right to appear at a preliminary hearing. He had the relevant clause memorized. Albus Dumbledore walked into courtroom 7 in robes of deep midnight blue, his half-moon glasses catching the light, his expression carrying the settled, sorrowing gravity of a man who has come to correct a misunderstanding that he wishes hadn't happened. He looked older than Harry had ever noticed him looking, and he moved with a careful deliberateness that might have been age or might have been something more considered. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him. "Headmaster Dumbledore," Marchbanks said. "This is a preliminary hearing. The named executor is entitled to submit written testimony, but oral appearance at this stage is, I am aware of the procedure, Griselda," Dumbledore said, gently. "I am not here to disrupt proceedings. I had hoped to speak with Harry before matters reached a formal stage. I see that ship has sailed." "It has," Harry said. His voice was even. Dumbledore turned to face him fully, and the room did that thing rooms sometimes did around him, a slight settling, an attention. Even the recording quills seemed to pause. "Harry. I owe you an explanation." "You do," Harry said. "But this isn't the venue for it. This is a probate hearing. If you'd like to submit written testimony, the procedure for that is on record. If you'd like to speak privately afterward, I'm willing to do that." A beat of silence. "The disbursements to the Dursley household," Dumbledore began, "were made under a fraudulent clause," Harry said. "The Gringotts certification is in the record. The signature on the authorization is also in the record. They were made to ensure your protection," Dumbledore said, and his voice was patient, sorrowing. "Your aunt's family required £300,000 over 13 years to house a child," Harry said, "who slept in a cupboard for 10 of those years." He kept his voice entirely level. "Not cold, level. The way you speak when you're stating facts. I appreciate that you believed you were doing the right thing. But what you believed doesn't change what the documentation shows. The clause was fraudulent. The disbursements were unauthorized. Those are legal facts. Harry." Dumbledore's voice was very quiet now. "There are reasons, greater reasons, that I placed you with your aunt's family. Reasons I have not yet been able to explain, then you can explain them to the committee," Harry said, "in writing, as the procedure provides." He turned to Marchbanks. "I'd like to note for the record that the executor has appeared in person at a preliminary hearing without prior notification, and I'd ask that his remarks be stricken from the testimony record as they were not submitted through the correct procedural channel." Marchbanks was looking at him with the bright, slightly delighted sharpness of someone watching something she hadn't expected to see but was thoroughly enjoying. She rapped her gavel. "So noted. Headmaster Dumbledore, remarks stricken. You are welcome to submit written testimony within 5 working days. At this stage, I must ask you to take a seat in the gallery or withdraw." Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. Harry met his eyes and waited. He wasn't angry. He wasn't cold. He was just present, and sure, in the way that comes from having thought everything through and being ready for all of it. Dumbledore sat in the gallery. Not near Ron and Hermione, he took a seat at the far end, and he looked at Harry once more with an expression that carried, under the sorrow and the gravity, something that might have been recognition. As if he was seeing something in Harry that he hadn't fully anticipated. "Good." Marchbanks called Ragnarok. The goblin stood at the evidence table with the composed authority of someone who had done this before, not nervously, not deferentially, but with the flat, exact professionalism of an entity that dealt in facts and had brought all of them. He confirmed the audit findings in precise detail, answered 4 questions from the committee members with complete clarity, and when Tiberius Ogden attempted to suggest that the protective housing compensation clause might have been authorized under a provision Ogden described vaguely as special wartime executor discretion, Ragnarok looked at him with the particular expression of someone dealing with an argument they find intellectually insulting. "There is no wartime executor discretion provision in the Potter Family Trust Charter," Ragnarok said. "There is no such provision in the 1797 Inheritance Act. There is no such provision in any Gringotts instrument or Wisengamot statute that I am aware of. If Mr. Ogden is referring to a specific legal text, I would invite him to produce it." Ogden did not produce it. Marchbanks moved on. Harry was called to answer questions. Marchbanks's questions were the ones Hermione had predicted, direct, precise, focused on the facts. When did he receive the audit notice? Had he been given prior disclosure of the disbursement arrangement? Was he aware, before receiving the notice, that quarterly payments had been made from his estate to his guardian's account? The answers were no, no, and Harry gave them without elaboration, because elaboration wasn't needed. One of the Career Civil Servant Committee members asked him something that wasn't in Hermione's notes, something about whether Harry was aware of the Muggle fraud proceedings he'd initiated. Yes, Harry said. You've engaged a Muggle solicitor. I have. Simultaneously with the ministry petition. Yes. The civil servant looked slightly unsettled by this, in the way that people sometimes are when they encounter someone who has used more than one available option. Are you expecting both proceedings to run concurrently? The Muggle fraud claim relates to Muggle law and a Muggle recipient, Harry said. This proceeding relates to Wizarding estate law and an executor's breach of trust. They're separate matters. There's no reason they can't run concurrently. Marchbanks made a small sound. It might have been approval. The hearing ran for 2.5 hours. At the end of it, Marchbanks called a brief committee consultation. The 5 of them retired to a side chamber for 20 minutes while Harry sat at his table and Ragnarok stood beside him, and from the gallery Ron passed Harry a note that said "You were brilliant" in very large letters, which Harry folded and put in his pocket. When the committee returned, Marchbanks sat, looked at the documentation one more time, and then looked at Harry. On the question of the preliminary merit of the petition, she said, the committee finds unanimously that the petition presents sufficient documented evidence of irregularity to proceed to full hearing. She paused. On the question of executor suspension pending full hearing, the committee finds, by 4 votes to 1, and here she glanced at Tiberius Ogden with the mild precision of someone noting something for the record, that the request meets the threshold under Section 14, Clause 7, and executor authority is hereby suspended pending the full committee determination. The recording quills scratched. The full hearing will be scheduled within 30 days, Marchbanks continued. All parties will receive formal notification. The petitioner is advised to prepare full submissions. She looked at Harry over her glasses with those bright, sharp eyes. Is there anything further from the petitioner at this stage? Harry stood. Yes, he said. One thing. He had not included this in his prepared material. He'd thought about it for 2 days and decided it didn't belong in the formal statement, but that it did need to be said, in this room, on this record, clearly and once. I want to state for the record, Harry said, that this petition is not filed out of anger, and it's not filed to damage Professor Dumbledore's reputation. It's filed because the estate my parents built, the future they wanted to give me, was managed in ways that weren't authorized, and that caused real harm. Not just to me financially. The fact that Vernon Dursley was receiving quarterly payments from my family's trust while telling me there was no money for things I needed, that's not a minor procedural error. That's a betrayal of what an estate arrangement is supposed to do. And I think the record should reflect that clearly. Silence. It will, Marchbanks said. She held his gaze for a moment with the expression of someone who has seen a great many things in a great many hearings, and is choosing to remember this one. Then she rapped her gavel. Hearing adjourned. The recording quills stopped. Harry sat down. He felt something release in his chest, not quite relief, because he hadn't been afraid. More like the specific satisfying sensation of a thing fitting together exactly the way it was supposed to. Ragnarok was already gathering his document case. The committee's preliminary finding will be published in the Wisengamot record by tomorrow morning, he said. The suspension of executor authority will take effect immediately. He paused. The hearing was conducted correctly, Mr. Potter. Thank you for being here, Harry said. I told you, Ragnarok said simply. We have been waiting some time for someone to ask the right questions. He left with his 2 colleagues, and Harry became immediately aware that Hermione and Ron had descended from the gallery and were now standing behind him. 4 to 1, Ron said. Ogden voted against, obviously, but 4 to 1, Harry. I know. Dumbledore's authority is frozen, Hermione said. She was holding her folder very tightly, and her voice was doing the thing it did when she was trying to sound academic about something that was actually making her emotional. Effective immediately. He can't make decisions about your guardianship or your estate until the full hearing. I know, Harry said again. He looked at her. Are you all right? She stopped. I'm very proud of you, she said, in a voice that was slightly smaller than her usual one. And I'm also very angry on your behalf, and I'm trying to decide which one to lead with. Lead with proud, Ron suggested. The angry will keep. Hermione made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in its vicinity. Harry looked at the far end of the gallery, where Dumbledore had been sitting. He was gone. The seat was empty. The door at the back of the gallery was very slightly ajar, the way doors are when someone has left recently and quietly. Harry had thought about this moment, the moment after, when the adrenaline of preparation and execution had burned down to something quieter. He'd thought he might feel something more definitive. Satisfaction, or closure, or some clean arrival at a place he'd been moving toward. What he actually felt was more complicated than that. There was satisfaction, yes, the deep, genuine satisfaction of a plan that had worked. But there was also the particular sorrow of having confirmed things you'd hoped might be wrong. Of looking at Dumbledore's handwriting on that authorization form and knowing it was genuine. He gathered his documents, put them in his bag, and looked at the empty courtroom, the record quills still, the evidence table cleared, the high benches abandoned. Come on, he said to Hermione and Ron. I want some air. They came out into the corridor, and then into the atrium, and then out onto the street above the ministry's underground entrance, emerging into an ordinary London Friday afternoon with people eating lunch outside and pigeons doing what pigeons do and the city moving around them in its complete indifference to wizarding legal procedure. Harry stood on the pavement and breathed the outside air. What happens now? Ron asked. Now, Harry said, we wait for the full hearing date. And while we wait, Vernon Dursley gets a letter from Ms. Fenn. He paused. Also, I think I should write to Sirius. Hermione and Ron both went still at that. The executor's suspension, Harry said, means Dumbledore can't make custody decisions about me. Which means I can ask for a formal review of my guardianship arrangements. He looked at them. Sirius is my godfather. He was never given a proper trial. Those are two facts that I think deserve to be in the same sentence. Ron said, slowly, you're going to get Sirius freed. I'm going to try, Harry said. I've got the same approach, documented, procedural, through the correct channels. And I've got someone in the DMLE who's paying very close attention to how this whole thing gets handled. He thought of Amelia Bones, that single nod in the atrium, the word will instead of might when she talked about the investigation. I think the moment is right. They stood on the street for a moment, the three of them, in the ordinary London afternoon. Harry, Hermione said quietly. Can I say something? You usually do. When you told the committee, that it wasn't just about money, that it was a betrayal of what an estate arrangement is supposed to be. She paused. That was the most important thing said in that room today. Harry looked at her. He thought about his parents, who had put their faith in arrangements they trusted, in people they trusted, and whose faith had been answered with a fraudulent clause and quarterly transfers to a man who resented their son for breathing. He thought about that, and about what it meant to put something right, not just legally but genuinely. It needed to be on the record, he said. I know, she said. I'm glad it is. The three of them started walking, no particular destination, just moving through the afternoon city, letting the day settle around them. Ron eventually said something about food, which was both completely typical and completely correct, and they found a place to eat, and they talked about things that weren't legal proceedings for an hour, and it was good. Harry was quiet for most of it. Not worried, just present. Thinking about Sirius in that dark, difficult place, thinking about the letter he'd write tonight, thinking about the machinery that was now running and the things it could still accomplish. The executor was suspended. The petition was on record. The Muggle fraud complaint was in motion. And somewhere in a solicitor's office in Clerkenwell, Margaret Fenn was drafting a letter to Vernon Dursley. Harry ate his lunch and thought about what came next. He was not done. Not even close. Chapter 5, The House on Privet Drive. The letter from Ms. Fenn arrived at number 4 on a Monday. Harry knew it was coming. He'd spoken to her by phone from the call box 2 streets over on Saturday morning, confirming the timeline, and she told him the formal notice of civil proceedings would be dispatched Friday and arrive by Monday at the latest. He'd been awake since 6, sitting at his window with his book open and his eyes on the street. The postman came at 7:30, sliding the usual assortment of envelopes through the slot. Harry heard them land on the mat. He heard Vernon's footsteps, that flat, heavy tread, cross the hallway. He heard the sound of envelopes being sorted. And then he heard nothing for a very long time. He got up, went downstairs, and found Vernon standing in the hallway with a white envelope in his hand and a color in his face that Harry had never seen before. Not the red of his usual anger, not the purple of magical fury. Something underneath both of those. Something gray and cold, like concrete. Vernon looked up. His eyes found Harry immediately. Harry looked back at him. He didn't say anything. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the table. The kitchen was quiet for almost a minute. Then Vernon came through the doorway and stood across the table from Harry with the letter in his hand. He'd opened it. His eyes moved between Harry's face and the letter, back and forth, with the slightly frantic quality of a man trying to find an exit in a room that doesn't have one. "What is this?" Vernon said. His voice was very controlled, which made it worse somehow, the control of someone gripping something very tightly rather than the control of someone who was actually calm. "It's a civil notice of proceedings," Harry said. "For fraudulent receipt of estate funds. This is insane. You can't." Vernon stopped. He put the letter on the table between them and pressed his hands flat on it, and the gesture was so strange and so unlike him that Harry thought, briefly and without particular charity, that Vernon might be having some kind of episode. "You are 14 years old." "I know how old I am," Harry said. "You can't take civil action. You're a minor." "My solicitor can act on my behalf," Harry said. "The engagement letter explaining that is on page 2. Vernon's left hand twitched. He didn't turn to page 2. "Harry." The name came out differently from Vernon's mouth than Harry had ever heard it, not the usual contemptuous shorthand, not the specific emphasis Vernon used when he was performing Patience. Something more stripped down. Almost human. "I don't know what you think you know. I have 13 years of quarterly transfer records from Gringotts to your Barclays account," Harry said. "Certified under the bank's charter. I have the fraudulent clause authorizing the payments and the name of who established it. I have a solicitor who specializes in estate fraud, a ministry probate petition that has already received a preliminary favorable finding, and a Department of Magical Law Enforcement investigation that is running concurrently." He kept his voice even. "Not cruel. Just exact. I know exactly what I know, Uncle Vernon." Vernon's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Harry watched them go by, disbelief, then a reaching for authority that found nothing to grip, then something that sat between rage and despair without being fully either. "The money was for your care," Vernon said, and something about the way he said it made it clear that he'd rehearsed this, or something like it, in the back of his mind for a while. "Expenses. The cost of taking you in, £300,000, Harry said. Vernon went quiet. "Over 13 years. In quarterly installments. To the Barclays account in your name." Harry looked at him. "Do you want to talk about what £300,000 covers in terms of expenses? We can do that, if you'd like. We can talk about the cupboard under the stairs, and the second-hand clothes, and the times I was told there was nothing in the budget for enough," Vernon said. The word came out like something snapping. Petunia had appeared in the kitchen doorway. Harry wasn't sure how long she'd been standing there. She was very quiet when she wanted to be, which was most of the time. She was holding a dish towel, which she wasn't using, and her eyes were moving between Vernon and Harry with an expression that was not the one Harry expected. He'd expected Petunia to look at him with the usual mixture of resentment and careful avoidance. Instead she looked at the letter on the table, and then at Harry, and her face was doing something complicated and entirely internal, the way Petunia's face always did when something reached past her considerable defenses. "Petunia," Vernon said, without looking at her. "A warning." She didn't move. "The civil proceedings are separate from the criminal complaint," Harry said, because he'd decided to say this clearly and without theater. "Ms. Fenn, my solicitor, has filed the civil claim. The police will receive a separate referral for the criminal matter. That process has its own timeline." Vernon's head came up sharply. "The police. Financial fraud. Fraudulent receipt of estate funds. Under the Fraud Act." Harry paused. "I didn't make that law. I just know it applies." "You're going to have me arrested," Vernon said, and the way he said it, the particular stunned flatness of it, was not anger anymore. It was something that Harry recognized, after a moment, as genuine shock. As if, despite everything, the possibility hadn't fully landed until this second. "I'm not going to have you arrested," Harry said. "The criminal justice system will decide what happens next, based on the evidence. I'm not in charge of that part. I just provided the documentation." "That's the same thing," Vernon said. "It really isn't," Harry said. Vernon pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He looked at the letter on the table. He looked at his hands. He looked like a man who had made a calculation a long time ago, a private, comfortable calculation, the kind of calculation that only works if no one ever checks it, and was watching that calculation come apart in real time. Harry looked at him and tried to find anger in himself and found it wasn't quite the right word for what was there. It was something harder and sadder than anger. He thought about this man's face across the dinner table for years, the deliberate obtuseness, the performed generosity, the way he'd talked about Harry as a burden and a complication while cashing 4 checks a year to compensate him for the performance. The sheer smallness of it. "Why?" Harry said. He hadn't planned to ask it. But he was asking it. Vernon looked up. "Why take the money?" Harry said. "You clearly didn't want me here. You made that plain enough. Why not just refuse? Tell Dumbledore you didn't want the arrangement." Vernon was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Harry thought he wasn't going to answer. "Your aunt," Vernon said finally, and then stopped. Petunia made a small sound in the doorway, not quite a word, just something involuntary. "Your aunt wanted you here," Vernon said. His voice was flat and tired. "I didn't understand it and I didn't like it, but she asked me." "And the money," he stopped again. His jaw worked. "The money made it easier to say yes." Harry looked at Petunia. She was looking at the floor. "Petunia wanted me here," Harry said slowly. Silence. It sat differently than the previous silences. It had more inside it. Harry thought about Petunia Dursley, her pinched observance of the neighbors' roses, her rigid domestic performances, her habit of watching Harry in the peripheral way of someone who couldn't quite bring themselves to look directly at something. He thought about the morning she'd gotten his Hogwarts letter and held it in both hands in the hallway, not opening it. He'd thought, at the time, that she was deciding whether to throw it away. Maybe she'd been deciding something else. He didn't know what to do with this information. He sat with it for a moment and found that it didn't change what had been done. Petunia's complicated grief for her sister and Vernon's greedy pragmatism had combined into 13 years of something that had damaged him in ways he was still taking inventory of, and good intentions, even the most genuine ones, didn't retroactively fix that. But it was a true thing that hadn't been true before. And he'd always rather know a true thing than not. The letter in that envelope, Harry said, has Miss Fenn's contact details. Your solicitor will need to contact her within 14 days or the civil proceedings move forward without a response. I'd recommend getting a solicitor quickly. He stood. That's all I wanted to say. He went upstairs. He sat on his bed for a while in the morning quiet of the house, listening to the muffled sounds below, Vernon's voice, very low, Petunia's responses, even lower, the particular register of a conversation being had in the hope that it can't be heard. He wasn't trying to listen. He just sat with the sounds of it, and the weight of the morning, and the specific complexity of being right about something that doesn't actually feel like winning. He picked up his quill and wrote to Sirius. He'd been drafting this letter in his head for 2 weeks, since the moment in the courtroom when the idea had solidified from something he was considering into something he was going to do. He'd written a version the night after the hearing and discarded it because it was too procedural, too much the language he'd been living in for 3 weeks. This version was different. This one started with "I've been doing some things you should know about" and went from there. He told Sirius everything. The Gringotts letter, the meeting with Ragnarok, the Muggle solicitor, the probate petition and its preliminary outcome. He told him about Dumbledore in the courtroom and the 4-1 vote on executor suspension. He told him about Vernon's face this morning and Petunia's silence and the true thing he hadn't known before. He wrote it all out in the order it happened, and when he got to the end he wrote, "Your name came up in the probate proceedings, not directly, but the question of my guardianship is now legally open in a way it wasn't before. I don't know if you know that Dumbledore's executor authority is suspended. What I want you to know is that I think the same machinery that's been moving on my behalf can move on yours. You were never given a trial. That's not a legal opinion, it's just a fact. Hermione is already researching the relevant statutes. If you're willing to try this, properly, through the right channels, the way I've been doing it, I think it's worth trying. I also just want you to know that you're the first person I thought of when the question of where I live next came up." Harry he folded it, sealed it, and sent Hedwig with it before he could revise it into something less honest. The rest of that day was strange. The house had a different quality to it, a held-breath quality, like a room where something loud has just stopped. Vernon did not appear for lunch. Petunia moved through the kitchen with the concentrated precision of someone directing their energy into something controllable. Dudley came home from a friend's house in the afternoon, registered the atmosphere with the animal accuracy that children develop in households with complicated undercurrents, and went immediately to his room. Harry worked at his desk. He was preparing his full submissions for the Wisengamot hearing, the formal written version of his case, which Hermione had outlined in meticulous detail and which he was drafting with the same care he'd brought to everything else this month. Outside, the late afternoon had turned golden and thick, the kind of summer light that makes Surrey look briefly like somewhere it isn't. He was halfway through section 2 when he heard the car. Not Vernon's car, a different engine, quieter. He heard it stop outside and looked out his window. A dark car, nondescript. 2 people getting out, both in suits, both with the particular bearing of people accustomed to going to addresses and having serious conversations there. Police. Harry watched them approach the front path with a calm interest that surprised him slightly. He'd known this part was coming. Ms. Fenn had told him the fraud referral had been submitted and that an initial inquiry visit was standard procedure. He'd known it would be soon. He hadn't known it would be today, which meant the timeline was moving faster than anticipated. He heard the doorbell. He heard Petunia open the door. He heard the voices, professionally neutral, the cadence of people introducing themselves, and then the door closing and the voices continuing inside, too low to make out. He went back to his draft. He'd covered section 2 and most of section 3 by the time the car left, 40 minutes later. He heard Vernon's footsteps on the stairs shortly after. They stopped outside his door. A pause, long, considering. Harry waited. He kept his quill moving. The footsteps moved on. The door did not open. Harry finished section 3, read back through what he had, made 4 corrections, and decided it was good enough to send to Hermione for review. He sealed it, wrote her name on the outside, and left it on his desk for Hedwig to take when she got back from Sirius. He went downstairs at 6 to make dinner. Not because it was his job, he'd stopped thinking of it as his job about 2 weeks ago, but because he was hungry and he could cook and the kitchen was empty. He made pasta because it was quick, ate it at the table, and left enough in the pot for whoever else wanted it. Petunia came in while he was washing up. She stood in the kitchen doorway in the way she'd been doing lately, present without committing to the room, and Harry kept washing up and let her be there. "The men who came," she said finally. "They're going to come back." "Probably," Harry said. She was quiet for a moment. "Vernon is calling a solicitor tomorrow." "That's sensible." Silence. The tap ran. Harry turned it off, dried his hands. "Your mother," Petunia said, and stopped. Harry turned to look at her. She was looking at the kitchen window, not at him, with an expression that had bypassed all her usual defenses and arrived somewhere raw underneath them. "Lily never knew about the money. I want you to know that. She died not knowing any of it was arranged." "I know," Harry said. "And then, because it was true, that's not on her." Petunia made a sound that was compressed and small. She looked briefly at Harry, the quickest, most direct look she'd ever given him, he thought, and then she looked away and left the room, and her footsteps went upstairs, and the house settled back into its complicated quiet. Harry stood in the kitchen for a moment. He thought about Lily Potter, who had arranged her estate in good faith and trusted the people she trusted. He thought about what Petunia had just said, she never knew, and he let himself feel the grief of that, which was different from the grief of his own situation. It was older and sadder and more irreversible. His mother had died not knowing the shape of what was coming. Harry had at least been able to find it out. He went upstairs, sat at his desk, and kept working. 2 days later, he had a visitor. He was in the back garden when he heard the crack, the specific, familiar sound of apparition, and turned to find Albus Dumbledore standing at the garden gate with his robes moving in the slight summer breeze and his expression carrying the particular quality of someone who has decided that a conversation they've been putting off has to happen now. Harry had been expecting this too. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "Professor," Harry said. He didn't put down the book he was holding. "You can come in." Dumbledore came through the gate and sat, uninvited but unsurprisingly, on the wooden garden bench that no one ever used because it was Petunia's aesthetic project rather than anyone's actual furniture. He looked at the garden, at the roses, at Harry, with the sad and patient quality that Harry used to find comforting. "I owe you a great deal more than an explanation," Dumbledore said. "I am aware of that. But I would like to give you one, if you're willing to hear it." "I'm willing," Harry said. He sat on the grass a few feet away, not defensive distance, just comfortable distance. "But I want to say something first." Dumbledore inclined his head. "I'm not here to fight with you," Harry said. "I'm not doing any of this because I want to hurt you or take something from you. I want you to know that clearly, because I think you might have come here expecting something different." He paused. "What I want is for the record to reflect what actually happened. And I want to make decisions about my own life going forward. That's it." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. "You are very like your father," he said. "In the best possible sense." "Tell me about the arrangement," Harry said. "The real reason." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment, arranging something in himself. "When your parents died," he said, I still believe, that the protection your mother's sacrifice created was real and significant. A protection tied to blood, to the location where that blood was housed. Your aunt is your mother's blood. While you could call this house home, that protection held." He met Harry's eyes. "I placed you here because I believed it was the safest place for you, given what I knew of the threat." "And the money?" Something moved in Dumbledore's expression, not evasion, Harry thought. More like the particular expression of someone acknowledging a judgment call they made in full awareness that it was contestable. "Your aunt and uncle were not eager to take you in. The arrangement, the disbursements, were my attempt to make the situation workable. To ensure they had both the means and, I hoped, some motivation to care for you properly. It didn't work, Harry said. The caring for me properly part. No, Dumbledore said quietly. It did not. And that is a failure I carry. He paused. The clause, the fraudulent clause, as Gringotts has correctly characterized it, I created it because no legitimate provision existed for what I was trying to accomplish. I used the executor authority to bridge that gap. I did not ask you, or anyone who might have spoken for you. I made the decision and arranged the world around it. Another pause. I was wrong to do it that way. Harry heard this. He sat with it for a moment, the admission, plain and unvarnished, from a man who was not accustomed to making them. I believe you, Harry said. That you believed it was right. I also think believing it was right didn't make it right. No, Dumbledore agreed. It did not. And I think, Harry continued, that the pattern of deciding what's best for me and arranging things accordingly, without telling me or asking me, that's a pattern that needs to stop. Not just legally. As a matter of, he searched for the right word. Respect. Dumbledore looked at him. That is a fair thing to ask. I'm not asking, Harry said, gently. I'm stating it. Going forward, if decisions affect my life, I'm part of making them. That's not negotiable. The garden was very quiet. A bee was working through Petunia's roses. The neighbor's lawnmower had started up somewhere down the street and then stopped again. Dumbledore nodded slowly. There is something else I should tell you, he said. Something you will need to know eventually, and I find I would rather tell you now, directly, honestly, without arrangement. He looked at Harry with the weight that Harry had always sensed in him and was now finally understanding the content of. The protection I spoke of, tied to your mother's blood, to this house, is a real thing. But it is tied to your living here. To calling this place home. When you leave, when I leave, Harry said, that protection ends. Yes. And you're telling me this now, Harry said, because I'm leaving. Dumbledore's eyes were very blue and very tired. I am telling you this now because you deserve to know what you're deciding with complete information. Not because I want to use it to keep you here. Those are different things, and I want to be sure you understand the distinction. Harry looked at him for a long moment. I understand the distinction, he said. And I appreciate it. He paused. I'm still leaving. I know, Dumbledore said. And his voice, when he said it, had the quality of something accepted completely. Not without grief, Harry could hear the grief, but without resistance. As if, in this specific moment, Albus Dumbledore had finally decided that Harry Potter's choices belonged to Harry Potter. They sat for a while longer, in the garden, in the summer afternoon. They didn't talk about much. Dumbledore asked about the hearing preparation, Harry gave him an honest answer, and at some point Dumbledore said something about Harry's father that made Harry ask a question, and that question got a real answer, one of several Dumbledore gave him that afternoon that went into a part of Harry's mind he'd return to later. It wasn't a reconciliation. Harry didn't think that was the right word for it, and he didn't think Dumbledore thought so either. It was something more complicated, an honest conversation between two people with a complicated shared history, one of whom had made serious errors and acknowledged them, and one of whom was deciding, in real time, how to carry those errors forward without letting them define the relationship entirely. By the time Dumbledore stood to leave, the garden was in late afternoon shadow. The hearing, Dumbledore said. I will submit written testimony, as the procedure requires. I will be honest in it. I know you will, Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him one more time, with that same quality of recognition he'd had in the courtroom, of seeing something he hadn't quite anticipated. Then he walked to the garden gate, and the crack of apparition, and he was gone. Harry sat in the garden for a while after that. Hedwig returned at dusk, and she had a letter. Harry recognized the handwriting on the outside before she'd fully landed, a slightly unsteady, impatient scrawl that wrote his name like it was in a hurry. He opened it. Harry. Of course I'm willing. I've been sitting in this house waiting for someone to tell me the thing I needed to hear, and you're 14 years old and you just said it. Hermione's already sent me 3 books about the relevant statutes, which I think she'd sent before you'd even posted your letter because she's terrifying in the best possible way. Remus is here with me and he's already annotating them. Between the two of us we've been through the DMLE filing procedures, and I actually think this can be done. Properly. The right way. Like you said. Harry. That part at the end of your letter. Don't write things like that to a man who is trying very hard not to cry in front of a werewolf. Come as soon as you can. We need to talk. There's so much to do. Serious P.S. The werewolf is crying too, so I'm less embarrassed than I could be. Harry read it twice. Then he laughed, genuinely, from somewhere uncomplicated, the way he hadn't laughed in a while. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket next to his parents' photograph. He went inside. He went upstairs. He began, methodically and without ceremony, to pack. Not the hurried packing of someone fleeing, the organized packing of someone who knows where they're going. Clothes, neatly folded. Books that mattered. The folder of legal documents in their proper order. The photograph. The letters from Hermione and Ron and Sirius, and the notes he'd made that first morning, sitting on his windowsill reading about unauthorized disbursements while the sparrows argued on the neighbor's aerial. He packed all of it, and when the bag was full and closed, he sat on the edge of his bed one more time and looked at the room. It was a small room. Not as small as the cupboard, he'd never forget the cupboard, and he didn't think he was supposed to, but small. The window looked out over the back garden where he'd just had the most honest conversation with Dumbledore he'd ever had. The door had a lock on the outside that he hadn't thought about in over a year. The ceiling was ordinary and low and had seen, over the years, a fair amount of Harry Potter lying on his back thinking about things. He was done thinking about things from this ceiling. He picked up his bag, called Hedwig to his shoulder, and went downstairs. Vernon was in the living room. He didn't look up when Harry passed the doorway. Petunia was in the kitchen. She looked up, and her eyes went to the bag, and she went through several things very quickly on her face before arriving at something that was not warmth but was the specific quality of a woman saying something final without saying anything at all. Harry stopped. He thought about the things she told him in the kitchen, she never knew, I want you to know that, and about what it cost her to say it. Take care of yourself, Harry said. Petunia looked at him. You too, she said, in a voice that was very small and very real. He went out through the front door. Privet Drive was quiet in the early evening, the lights coming on in windows, the street doing its faithful impression of a place where nothing happened. Number 4 sat behind him, its perfect lawn and its net curtains and its 13 years of complicated, damaging ordinary life. Harry stood on the pavement with his bag on his shoulder and his owl on his wrist, and he didn't look back at it. He'd meant what he told Dumbledore. He wasn't leaving in anger. He was leaving because he had somewhere to be, and people to be there with, and work still to do. The last golden light of the day was on the rooftops. He walked to the end of the street, held out his wand, and stepped forward into the evening. Chapter 6, What Remains. The safe house was in Exeter. Not Grimmauld Place. Sirius had been clear about that in his second letter, the practical one that followed the emotional one by about 6 hours. Grimmauld is compromised in too many directions right now. Remus found us something better. Come by night bus, stop at the Exeter High Street, walk north on 4 Street until you see the blue door with the brass fox knocker. It'll let you in. The night bus deposited Harry on a wet Exeter pavement at just past 9 in the evening, and he found the blue door without difficulty, and the door did let him in, swinging open before he could knock, as if the house had been watching for him. Inside was warm and smelled like wood smoke and old books, and Sirius Black was standing in the hallway with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting longer than the evening. They looked at each other for a moment. Sirius looked better than the last time Harry had seen him, better than Azkaban gaunt, though still carrying the marks of it in the way his face fell slightly at rest, the grey at his temples that hadn't been there in the photographs Harry's parents kept. He was standing straight, though. His eyes were the thing Harry noticed most, clear and dark and fully present in a way they hadn't been in the cave near Hogwarts, when he'd still been partly somewhere else. "You're taller," Sirius said. "You're less grey than I expected," Harry said. Sirius crossed the hallway in 2 strides and pulled Harry into a hug that was thorough and entirely unself-conscious, the kind of hug that doesn't negotiate with itself about whether it's appropriate. Harry stood in it for a moment and felt something in his chest that had been held at a certain tension for weeks release in a way he hadn't known he was waiting for. "Come in," Sirius said, stepping back and taking Harry's bag before Harry could argue. "Remus made dinner. There's a lot to tell you and I want to tell you all of it with food involved because the last few weeks have been a significant amount." Remus Lupin was in the kitchen, which smelled like something genuinely good was happening in a pot on the stove. He looked up when Harry came through the door with the expression of someone whose face doesn't perform emotion easily but is doing it anyway, a warm, careful smile, the kind that has a history behind it. "Harry," he said. "Sit down. You look like you've been eating sandwiches on tubes for a month." "Mostly pasties," Harry said. "But yes." They ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, which was both ordinary and completely extraordinary, the specific extraordinariness of a thing that should have existed years ago and was only now getting its chance. Sirius talked fast, the way he always did when he had a lot to say and was making up for years of not saying things. Remus interjected with corrections and additional detail and the occasional dry observation that made Harry laugh in the unguarded way he'd laughed reading Sirius's letter. The legal situation was this: Hermione had, over the preceding 2 weeks, constructed a case for Sirius's formal exoneration that Sirius described as the most terrifying document I've ever read, and Remus described as thorough beyond any reasonable expectation. It established 4 things: that Sirius had never received a trial, which was a procedural violation of the basic wizarding rights established in the Charter of 1672, that Peter Pettigrew was alive and had been confirmed as such by multiple witnesses at Hogwarts the previous year, that the DMLE's case file on Sirius contained no physical evidence of the Pettigrew killing beyond eyewitness accounts from a scene that had been inadequately investigated, and that the original commitment order had been signed not by a Wisengamot justice but by Bartemius Crouch Sr. acting under emergency wartime provisions that had expired before Sirius was imprisoned. This last point was the one that mattered most, legally. Crouch signed the commitment under emergency wartime provisions, Remus said, stirring his tea, which required annual renewal from the Wisengamot. He renewed them twice and then the 3rd renewal was denied, which should have triggered an automatic review of every commitment made under those provisions. It never happened. "Because nobody was checking," Harry said. "Because nobody was checking," Remus agreed. "Or nobody wanted to." Crouch had significant political capital in the ministry at that point and Azkaban's record-keeping was, well. He paused. Azkaban's record-keeping was what you'd expect of a prison run by creatures that feed on happiness. "Amelia Bones," Harry said. "She told me the DMLE was running an investigation into the estate fraud. If the same investigation looks at the guardianship question, it already is," Sirius said. "She sent me a letter. Formally. Through Remus as an intermediary, because the ministry technically still has a warrant out on me, but," he paused, and the pause had something complex in it, something between disbelief and a careful, fragile hope. "She's reopening the case file. Officially. Under the procedures for reviewing commitments made under expired emergency provisions." Harry looked at him across the table. "That's because of the probate proceedings." "That's because of you," Sirius said plainly. "The probate proceedings opened a door," Harry said. "You're walking through it." "Harry." "What?" Sirius leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and looked at him with the directness that Harry had always found striking in him, no deflection, no distance, just the thing he was actually saying. "You filed a probate petition at 14 years old." You engaged a Muggle solicitor. You appeared before a Wisengamot committee and got a 4-to-1 preliminary finding. You had a frank conversation with Albus Dumbledore in a garden and came away with something like an honest accounting. He paused. I'm not just talking about the legal machinery. I'm talking about the fact that you did all of that as yourself, without performing it, without hiding what you wanted or pretending to be less clear about it than you were. Harry looked at him. Your father would have been completely insufferable about it, Sirius said. In the best possible way. He'd have told everyone he met. Remus made a sound into his tea that was definitely a laugh wearing a thin disguise. Harry felt the warmth of it, the specific warmth of being known accurately, which is different from being praised. He felt it and let it be there without deflecting it. Tell me what we need to do for your case, he said. The petition process, I know it well enough now. What's different about a wrongful imprisonment filing versus an estate petition? Sirius pushed a folder across the table. Hermione sent this. She called it a primer, which I think is what she calls things when she thinks they'll overwhelm us and wants to be gentle about it. How many pages? 41. That's gentle for Hermione, Harry said, taking it. He read for an hour while Sirius and Remus talked around him, not ignoring him but giving him the space to absorb the material without interruption, which was the correct instinct. The wrongful imprisonment process was different from the probate petition in its structure but similar in its essential logic: documented evidence of procedural failure, submitted to the correct office, through the correct channels, with certified supporting materials. The key difference was that Sirius needed a witness. Not a character witness, a factual one. Someone who could attest, under oath, to having seen Peter Pettigrew alive after the incident on the Muggle Street. Someone whose account couldn't be dismissed as motivated by loyalty to Sirius. Hermione and I both saw him, Harry said, not looking up from the folder. You're 14, Remus said. Defense will argue you're either confused or loyal. Ron saw him too. And Snape was there, at the end. Snape will not testify for Sirius, Remus said, with the careful flatness of someone stating a fact they find personally irritating but have accepted. I know. Harry turned a page. What about the Marauders map? The map showed Peter as a living person in Hogwarts for an entire year. That's not eyewitness testimony, it's a magical instruments record. Sirius sat up slightly. Remus put his cup down. The map identifies living people by name and footprint, Harry continued. It was made by people who knew Peter, intimately, magically. If we can enter the map itself as evidence, combined with testimony from me and Hermione and Ron, and the procedural violations, can a magical map be entered as evidence in a Wisengamot proceeding? Sirius asked. I don't know, Harry said. He looked at Remus. Do you? Remus was quiet for a moment with the expression of someone excavating something specific from a large mental archive. Enchanted objects can be entered as physical evidence if their magical properties can be verified by a certified examiner. The Department of Mysteries has an artifact verification team. He paused. Amelia Bones has access to that team. Right, Harry said. He wrote that down. So, the map, 3 witness statements from last year, the procedural violations Hermione documented, and the expired commitment order. He looked at his notes. That's enough to file. Enough to file, Remus said carefully. Whether it's enough to, it's enough, Harry said. Not dismissively, with the specific confidence of someone who had looked at legal thresholds enough times in the past month to recognize when they were met. The procedural violations alone are enough to trigger mandatory review. Everything else is what makes the review go the right way. He looked at Sirius. Are you ready to do this? Sirius had been watching him with an expression Harry was getting familiar with, the one that appeared when something he'd hoped for turned out to be real rather than imagined. Yes, he said. Then we file next week. I'll contact Amelia Bones's office Monday morning, tell her the filing is coming, and ask about the artifact verification process for the map. Hermione can draft the submission, she'll want to anyway, and she's better at the formal language than any of us. He looked at Remus. Will you write one of the witness statements? Without hesitation, Remus said quietly. Harry nodded. He closed the folder. Outside the kitchen window, Exeter was settling into a proper night, the sky clear for the first time in days, a few stars visible above the rooftops. One more thing, Harry said. Sirius, when this goes through, when the exoneration is filed and the case is reviewed, I want to talk about formal guardianship. He kept his voice straightforward. Dumbledore's executor authority is suspended. The question of where I live is legally open. I want it settled properly, with guardianship transferred to you officially and on record, not as an informal arrangement. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. You want that? I want that, Harry said. Even knowing there's a process, it could take, I know about processes, Harry said. I've been doing processes for a month. I'm not afraid of another one. Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, James used to say that about you. He stopped. He used to say, before you were born, when Lily was pregnant, he used to say that whatever kid came out of that was going to be completely unstoppable. He paused, and something crossed his face that was old and aching and genuine. He was right. Harry said nothing for a moment, just let the weight of that sit. Don't make me get emotional before we do the legal filing, he said finally. I need to be in a specific headspace. Remus laughed. Sirius made a sound that was in the vicinity of a laugh but had water in it. They stayed up until midnight, working. Hermione's 41-page primer was divided into sections, action items were noted, a rough timeline was sketched out on the back of an envelope by Remus, who had the precise, organized handwriting of someone who had spent years making legible notes in difficult conditions. By the time Harry went to the room they'd set up for him, small, plainly furnished, with a window that looked out over a terracotta roofscape, he had a clear picture of the next 3 weeks. He sat on the bed and read through the action list one more time. Then he put it down and sat quietly for a minute, the way he'd been doing at the end of each day of this month, taking stock, feeling the full shape of where things were. The Gringotts audit, certified and in evidence. The Muggle fraud complaint, filed, initial police inquiry completed, Vernon's solicitor had contacted MS. Fenn and the civil proceedings were formally underway. The Wisengamot probate petition, preliminary finding in his favor, full hearing in 19 days, Dumbledore's written testimony submitted 3 days ago and, according to Edith Lowry, who had sent him a procedural update, thorough and honest. The executor suspension, in effect. The DMLE investigation, ongoing under Amelia Bones's direct oversight. And now, the wrongful imprisonment filing. The map. The witness statements. The path to Sirius's exoneration and then to formal guardianship, laid out on the back of an envelope in Remus Lupin's handwriting. He lay back on the bed and stared at the unfamiliar ceiling and thought, for the first time in a month, not about the next move but about the distance already covered. He thought about the morning in his room at Privet Drive, reading the Gringotts letter on his windowsill while the sparrows argued on the neighbor's aerial. He'd been alone then, not frightened, but alone, with nothing but the letter and the number at the bottom of the second page and the beginning of a very clear decision. He'd made the decision and started moving, and he'd done most of it by himself, with Hermione's research and Ron's loyalty and Ragnar's professional integrity and Amelia Bones's procedural exactness, but the choosing of it, the direction of it, had been his. He was still alone in that sense. Still the person making the calls, setting the pace, deciding what came next. But the aloneness felt different now. Not the aloneness of having no one, but the aloneness of being the center of something, the hub around which good people were doing good work. He slept well. The full Wisengamot hearing happened on a Thursday, 19 days after the preliminary finding. Harry arrived at the ministry at 9, an hour before the hearing. Ragnar was already there, with the same 2 goblins and the same document cases and the same impression of entities who find the concept of being impressed by governmental architecture philosophically uninteresting. Hermione arrived at 9:15 with Ron, both of them slightly breathless from the apparition point, Hermione carrying a folder that had grown since the last hearing to approximately twice its original thickness. "You've been busy," Harry said. "I found 3 additional precedents supporting the fraudulent clause argument," she said, opening the folder. "And I cross-referenced the executor suspension clause with Hermione," Ron said. "He's been busy too. Let him breathe." "I'm fine," Harry said. "Show me the precedents." She showed him the precedents. He read them in the corridor outside courtroom 7, standing with his back to the wall and his folder open, while the ministry moved around him and Ragnarok waited with the patience of someone who charges by the hour and has already charged quite a lot. The committee was the same 5 members. Griselda Marchbanks came in first again and looked at Harry with the same bright, sharp interest she'd had at the preliminary hearing, as if she'd been looking forward to this, which Harry suspected was true in the way that people who are very good at their work look forward to cases that require them to be very good at their work. Tiberius Ogden looked less comfortable than he had at the preliminary hearing. He arranged his documents carefully and did not look at Harry. Dumbledore's written testimony was entered into the record first, read aloud by the committee clerk in the particular flat recitative of official proceedings. Harry listened to it. It was, as Dumbledore had promised in the garden, honest. It acknowledged the fraudulent clause, acknowledged the authorization, acknowledged the absence of legal basis for the protective housing compensation arrangement, and provided a full account of his reasoning at the time. The reasoning was, as Harry had known it would be, genuine, considered, and insufficient as a legal defense while being comprehensible as a human one. Then Harry presented. He'd refined his submission twice since the preliminary hearing. It was tighter now, the argument cleaner, the language doing exactly what it needed to do without excess. He went through it section by section, answered the committee's questions with precision, and when Tiberius Ogden suggested, obliquely, carefully, that the executor's intent should be given significant weight in the committee's determination, Harry said, without particular heat, the question before the committee isn't whether Executor Dumbledore intended harm. The question is whether the clause was legally valid. The Gringotts certification establishes that it wasn't. Intent doesn't retroactively create legal authority for an unauthorized action. Marchbanks made the small sound again. This time Harry was certain it was approval. Ragnarok testified for 45 minutes. He was extraordinary, not dramatic, not persuasive in the rhetorical sense, just exact. Every number, every date, every procedural irregularity laid out with the comprehensive completeness of someone whose institution's credibility depended on accuracy and knew it. When Ogden pushed on the question of Gringotts' own oversight failure, Ragnarok agreed with the same flat, self-accountable honesty he'd shown Harry in the private meeting room 6 weeks ago. The bank failed in its oversight obligation, Ragnarok said. We acknowledge this fully, have apologized to the account holder, and have committed to reimbursement. Our failure does not diminish the fraudulent nature of the clause, which was created outside our management and without our knowledge. The hearing ran for 3 hours. The committee retired for 40 minutes. Harry sat at his table and ate the sandwich Hermione had apparently brought for exactly this purpose and which she produced from her bag with the efficiency of someone who had anticipated a long morning. Ron ate the other half and said nothing, which was the exact right thing to do. When the committee returned, Marchbanks sat, arranged her papers, and looked at Harry. In the matter of probate petition 7741-P, she said, the Wisengamot Probate Committee finds unanimously that the protective housing compensation clause established by Executor Albus Dumbledore in November 1981 has no basis in the Potter Family Trust Charter, no authorization under the Inheritance Act of 1797, and constitutes a fraudulent disbursement arrangement. She paused. The committee orders full recovery of all disbursed funds from the relevant recipients, to be returned to the Potter Family Trust. The committee further orders that Executor Dumbledore's authority over the Potter Family Trust be permanently revoked, effective immediately. The recording quills scratched. The committee additionally notes, Marchbanks continued, and her voice had shifted slightly, still formal, but with the quality of someone adding something they consider important, that the petitioner, Harry James Potter, pursued this matter with exceptional procedural competence, complete honesty in his submissions, and a consistent focus on legal correctness over personal advantage. The committee wishes this noted in the record. Harry looked at his hands on the table for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "The committee is adjourned." Marchbanks rapped her gavel. She looked at Harry one last time, over her glasses, with those bright eyes. "Good luck, young man," she said quietly. "I suspect you won't need it." Outside in the corridor, Hermione pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment and then said, from behind it, "Unanimous." "Harry, that was unanimous." "I know," Harry said. Ron was grinning the way he grinned when something good happened to someone he loved, wide and genuine and completely without reserve. "Unanimous," he repeated, like the word was something he wanted to say again. "Unanimous." Ragnarok appeared at Harry's shoulder. "The reimbursement from Gringotts's reserves will be processed within 5 working days. The recovery proceedings against the individual recipients will be initiated through our legal department." He paused. "The bank is satisfied with the proceedings' outcome." "So am I," Harry said. Ragnarok held out his hand. Harry shook it. "Mr. Potter," the goblin said. "It has been an honor to be correctly audited." Harry laughed. It was the most genuinely goblin thing he'd ever heard. "For me too," he said. The weeks that followed moved differently from the intense, propulsive pace of the petition process. They moved with the particular rhythm of things working as they're supposed to, steadily, procedurally, each step following the previous one with the satisfying logic of correctly laid groundwork. Sirius's wrongful imprisonment filing went in 10 days after the probate hearing. Amelia Bones received it personally. The Marauders map was submitted for artifact verification and the Department of Mysteries team confirmed, in a written assessment that Hermione read approximately 7 times, that the map's enchantments were genuine, its identification methodology was sound, and its record of Peter Pettigrew's footprint in Hogwarts was verifiable. The 3 witness statements, Harry, Hermione, and Remus, were entered into the DMLE case file. Remus's was the most technically detailed. Harry's was the most direct. Hermione's was the most footnoted, which was appropriate. The case review took 3 weeks. Amelia Bones conducted it herself, which meant it was done without leaks and without political interference, and when it was done she submitted her findings to the Wisingamot with a cover letter that Harry, when Sirius showed it to him, read 3 times because the language in it was the kind of language you don't often see in official documents, unequivocal and entirely certain. The Wisingamot issued Sirius Black's formal exoneration on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 4 days before Harry was due to start his 4th year at Hogwarts. Harry was in the kitchen of the Exeter house when Sirius came downstairs with the official parchment in his hand. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the exoneration letter and said nothing for a moment, and Harry put down his book and looked at him. "Done?" Harry said. Sirius nodded. His voice, when it came, was careful and slightly rougher than usual. "Done." Harry stood up and crossed the kitchen and they stood in the doorway together with the letter between them and the September morning coming through the window, clear and clean and ordinary, the kind of morning that happens regardless of what's being decided or resolved, the world moving along in its complete indifference to how significant things feel from the inside. "Formal guardianship next," Harry said. Sirius made a sound. "Hermione's already drafted the application." "Of course she has. She sent it last night with a note that said I thought you might need this soon and I don't know whether to be grateful or frightened." "Both," Harry said. "Always both with Hermione." The guardianship application went in the following week. It was, of all the filings and petitions Harry had been part of over the past 8 weeks, the simplest, not procedurally, but in the essential weight of it. A form. Names. Signatures. The dry machinery of legal documentation applied to the very undry fact of where Harry Potter was going to live and with whom. It was approved in 17 days. Harry was at Hogwarts when the approval came through, he'd started his 4th year on schedule, which had felt strange after the intensity of the summer but also right, in the way that returning to something familiar after a long unusual journey feels right. He'd gone back to Hogwarts as himself, and himself was different in ways he was still taking inventory of, and that was fine. That was how it was supposed to go. The letter arrived by Gringotts Owl during breakfast one morning in October. He opened it at the table, read the first line, and put it down. Ron looked at him. "Well? Done," Harry said. Ron picked up the letter and read it. He passed it to Hermione. She read it and her eyes went slightly bright, which she managed with tremendous dignity. She handed it back to Harry. "The estate restitution is also fully processed," she said, because she had been tracking everything on a chart that she kept in her dormitory and updated weekly. "The recovery proceedings against Vernon Dursley are ongoing on the civil side, and his solicitor has indicated they'll likely settle rather than go to trial." She paused. "Ms. Fenn sent me an update yesterday." "Of course she did," Ron said. "I asked her to," Hermione said. "Of course you did," Ron said, not unkindly. Harry looked at the letter, the guardianship approval, formal and stamped and entirely real. He thought about the morning this had all started, the Gringotts Owl landing on his windowsill with that cream-colored envelope, Vernon's footsteps below, the number at the bottom of the second page. He thought about all the pieces of it, Ragnar's precise honesty, Marchbanks's small sound of approval, Amelia Bones's word will instead of might, Dumbledore in the garden with the late afternoon shadow on the roses. Petunia saying she never knew in a voice that cost her something. Sirius in the Exeter kitchen with the exoneration letter, saying done in a rough voice. He thought about Ms. Fenn at her desk in Clerkenwell reading the Gringotts documentation for the first time and going still at the transfer figures. He thought about Edith Lowry in the probate office stamping his petition with the deliberate weight of someone who knew what they were starting. He thought about Hermione's 41-page primer with the sticky note that said this one's important, and Ron's note passed down from the gallery that said you were brilliant in very large letters. He folded the guardianship approval letter carefully along its original creases and put it in his breast pocket, next to the photograph of his parents. "I want to write to Sirius," he said. "Go ahead," Hermione said. "I'll take notes on the rest of breakfast." "You don't need to take notes on breakfast," Ron said. "The bacon-to-toast ratio has been inconsistent for 3 weeks. I'm documenting it." Harry was already writing. "Sirius, it came through this morning at breakfast. Hermione has a chart. I'll see you at Christmas. We should do something properly ridiculous for it, since neither of us has had a real one in a while. Remus should come. The Weasleys will probably come whether we invite them or not, which is fine with me. I keep thinking about something you said, about Dad, about what he used to say before I was born. I've been thinking about it since Exeter and I wanted to say, I know I'm not him. But I think I'm starting to know what I am, which is something. I think that's what this summer did, more than anything else. It showed me what I am when I'm actually allowed to be it. The Potter estate is in good shape, by the way. Ragnar sends quarterly updates now, which I asked for, and the properties are all being properly managed, and the trust is healthy. I'll tell you the full numbers at Christmas. You'll be irritatingly proud. Come and collect me from Hogwarts at Christmas properly. With the motorbike if it still runs. Hermione will have objections about motorbike safety and Ron will ignore all of them and I want to see all of that happen. Harry P.S. The guardianship letter is in my pocket next to Mum and Dad's photograph. Just so you know where I keep important things. He sealed it and gave it to Hedwig, who had arrived for the morning as she always did, floating in through the Ollery window as if she owned it, which she essentially did. She took the letter with the dignified competence of an owl who had carried more significant post this year than most owls carry in a lifetime. Harry watched her go and turned back to his breakfast. The great hall was doing its usual morning thing, the 100 separate conversations, the owls coming and going, the enchanted ceiling showing a pale October sky with cloud moving in from the west. Across the hall, Neville Longbottom was having an animated disagreement with his toad. 2 tables over, the Slytherins were performing their usual studied indifference to everything. The Hufflepuffs were, as always, the most straightforwardly cheerful people in any room. Harry ate his breakfast. He had Transfiguration first period, then double potions, which was always an exercise in managing one's expectations of the day. He had a letter to write to Ms. Fenn acknowledging the civil proceedings update. He had a charms essay due Thursday that he'd started but not finished. He had, in other words, the ordinary texture of a life proceeding normally. A life with a legal guardian, a restored estate, an honest accounting of what had been done in his name and what had been done to him, and the clean, workable satisfaction of having put things right through patience and preparation and the willingness to use every legitimate tool available. He wasn't finished, exactly. He didn't think he was the kind of person who was ever finished. There was the 4th year ahead of him, with whatever it contained, and Sirius's continued recovery from 12 years of the impossible, and the larger questions about Voldemort and what was coming that Harry could feel at the edge of everything, waiting. He didn't pretend those things weren't there. But they were there on different terms now. He'd spent a summer proving something, not to Dumbledore, not to the Wizengamot, not to Vernon Dursley sitting in a house in Surrey with a solicitor's letter on his kitchen table. He'd proven it to himself, which was the only proof that counted. He knew what he was when he was allowed to be it. He knew how to move through the world, clearly, directly, without hiding his understanding or his capability or his absolute certainty about what was right. He knew how to prepare, how to file, how to sit in a formal room and say the true thing in the way that makes it stick. He knew that institutions were fallible and law was usable and that the people who assumed he was manageable had significantly miscalculated. And he knew, sitting at the breakfast table in the Great Hall in October with his friends beside him and his godfather free and his parents' photograph in his pocket, that whatever came next, he was going to meet it the same way he'd met all of this. Not with rage. Not with performance. Not with the careful smallness of someone who has been told, repeatedly, to be less. With preparation. With clarity. With the particular, patient, devastating effectiveness of someone who has looked at every available option and chosen the right one. Harry Potter finished his breakfast, picked up his bag, and went to class.